That afternoon, the sky over Georgia wore a heavy ash-gray veil, as if even the sun was too tired to shine down on a land that had endured too much pain. A breeze drifted through the worn rooftops, carrying the faint scent of gasoline from the small garage at the end of the street where Elias Granger stood with his head bowed, hands stained with motor oil, and eyes hollow, like a man still trapped on some distant battlefield. 3 years had passed. 3 years since Elias was airlifted out of the blast zone in Kandahar. And 3 years since they told him that Shadow the K9, trained from puppyhood to serve by his side, hadn't survived. They said no body was found. They said the explosion was too powerful. They said it was best to leave everything buried out there. But Elias never did. Every night, after the garage lights went dark and the small wooden house at the end of the road fell into silence, Elias kept one ritual alive. He placed a wooden photo frame beside his pillow. Inside was a weathered picture, its edges faded by night fog. In it, Elias stood in uniform, his arm around Shadow the proud German shepherd in a ballistic vest, ears alert, head high, and eyes that stared ahead with a courage that no fire could bend. He wasn't a dog, Elias once said to a friend. He was the only teammate who ever ran into flames just to pull me out. No hesitation, no questions. In Elias's world, some things simply couldn't be replaced. And Shadow was one of them. By the window, the gray shag rug remained untouched where Shadow used to curl up after patrol. The stainless steel water bowl still sat beside it, though it had long been dry and silent. And hanging quietly from the coat hook on the wall, a black collar with faded engraving. Shadow, K9, 42B. Elias had never taken it down. He never brought home another dog. Someone once asked why. Elias simply said, "Because he's still here." That afternoon, as the skies darkened with rain, Elias sat alone on the old wooden chair out on the porch. The rain hadn't come yet, but the air had turned damp and cold. From his shirt pocket, he pulled out a weathered keychain with a brass name tag. It was once attached to Shadow's armor, the only thing recovered from the explosion. Elias turned it slowly in his fingers, then pressed it against his chest, a silent habit no one was around to see anymore. He didn't cry. The old soldier had endured more loss than most could ever fathom. But in his eyes was something sharper than tears, a quiet emptiness, deep and unmoving. In Elias's mind, Shadow's bark still echoed through the nights, sometimes a warning growl, sometimes the excited howl when the kennel door creaked open. And some nights, Elias would jolt awake, heart racing from a dream of a leap, a lick to the hand, one more look into those soulful eyes. But every morning the house stayed as quiet as before. And Shadow's resting place remained empty. Elias had no idea that just a few blocks away, behind the rust-stained bars of a kennel at the Jefferson County Rescue Shelter, another soul was lying still beneath the soft tapping of rain on the corrugated roof. A creature marked by a long scar down its ribs, and a memory that never stopped aching. Shadow was curled tightly, his body pressed into the coldest corner of the cage. His eyes weren't fully shut, nor wide open. They hovered somewhere in between, just enough to track every dim movement beyond the mesh. Not because he was afraid, but because sleep had never felt safe. The breeze slipped through a crack in the door, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and old metal. Shadow sniffed once, gently lifting his head. It wasn't food. It wasn't a stranger. It was something older than either of those, like ash buried in memory, like the faint, bitter scent of spent gunpowder clinging to the past. Beneath his belly lay a thin layer of cloth, once part of an old bed sheet. The staff called it his new bed. But nothing felt new to Shadow when his mind was still chained to somewhere else. The first night he arrived, Shadow barked, not to scare anyone, but to call out. No one understood. They shook their heads and scribbled in their reports. They labeled him unpredictable, wrote down the words PTSD, high risk, unsuitable for contact. No one noticed how he panted in his sleep, his legs twitching with memories of running. No one saw the flicker in his eyes every time a man's footsteps echoed down the hall. There was no panic in that look, no joy either, only waiting. Because deep in Shadow's memory lived the face of a man who once held him close after every firefight, a man who pressed his hand gently to the top of his head and whispered, "Good job, old boy." A man who once stood in a desert, thunderous with gunfire, and said, "If I die, I want to die beside you." Then came the explosion. Then blood. Then chaos, the blur of lights, the metallic clang of shattered gear, the roar of helicopters overhead, the sting of burning powder still hanging in the air. And then, nothing. Shadow couldn't remember how he made it out. He didn't know who pulled him from the rubble. What he did remember was the silence. No more Elias, no more steady hand, no more voice calling his name, Shadow 42B, like a promise wrapped around survival. From that moment on, it was just a blur of cages and strange faces. Sometimes they tied him up. Sometimes they shoved him into overcrowded pens where the hunger was louder than the barking. Sometimes people reached out to touch him. Shadow growled. Not out of violence. But because if it wasn't Elias, he didn't want to be touched again. This rainy afternoon, Shadow made no sound. He didn't bark. He just lay still. But his ears lifted. His eyes opened a little wider. Somewhere, far off, a sound broke through the hush. It was familiar, faint but unmistakable. The rumble of an old engine straining against the rain. A sound he remembered from the days riding back to base beside Elias. The slow crunch of tires on wet gravel. The squeak of a car door opening. Footsteps. And a rhythm that his memory still knew by heart. A familiar shape, large yet frail, was curled up in the corner of the kennel. The ears were pinned back, the body still. But the moment those footsteps echoed down the hall, the figure sprang up like a coiled spring finally released. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time forgot how to move. Elias stepped back half a pace, his lips parted, but no words came out. Shadow. Shadow's forelegs froze mid-step on the cold concrete floor. He didn't bark, didn't run. He just stood there, staring at the face in front of him, the face once smeared in blood and desert dust, the face Shadow had believed was lost forever on foreign ground. Elias stepped closer. Slowly. His hand trembled as he reached for the kennel door. "Is that Shadow?" No command, no call, no cue. But Shadow moved forward. No hesitation. No growl. Just a quiet press of his muzzle into the center of Elias's open palm. A sound escaped. Not loud. Just the gentlest hush, like wind slipping through leaves. But it was enough. Elias knew that sound, a shallow breath. Shaken. His knees gave way. He sank to the floor, his hands meeting the ground. "Old boy, is it really you?" A tail brushed against his hand, then swayed again, soft and slow. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias wept. Not the cry of a soldier, but the cry of a man who had lost the most precious part of his soul, only to find it returned. Shadow had rarely barked, not since arriving at the Jefferson shelter. Every day passed in silence, filled only with the sigh of wind between the bars and the steady march of military boots pacing by. But that day, Shadow barked. Not without reason, just one bark. Low, hoarse, like the echo of a bell rung long ago in a place scorched by sun and heavy with the scent of gunpowder. Elias was setting a donation bag on the front counter when his whole body tensed. He didn't even think. He just turned instinctively, eyes locked on the hallway behind the reception desk. It was just one bark. But Elias knew that sound like he knew his own heartbeat. He had heard it in the freezing nights of Kandahar when Shadow caught the scent of buried mines, when Shadow warned of strangers, when Shadow charged through smoke and fire straight toward him. Elias didn't say a word. He just moved. No one had to guide him. He didn't ask for directions. He walked like someone who had already left pieces of his soul in that place. The hallway to the kennels was dim, the flicker of weak fluorescent lights painting the floor in patches. The air was thick with the sharp bite of disinfectant and the musky weight of wet dogs. Most people would wrinkle their nose. Elias felt nothing but the pounding in his chest. He stopped at the third kennel from the end. Everything went still. Inside sat a creature, large, thin, one ear folded down, back slightly hunched from an old injury, and the eyes, those eyes. Elias stepped closer. His hand reached for the bars. Shadow? No movement. Elias drew in a slow breath. His voice dropped, gentler now. It's me. No growl. None of the defensive reactions the staff had warned about. Just a slow, deliberate shift. Shadow lifted his head, tilted it, then moved closer to the front of the cage. His eyes weren't as clear as before. There was a cloudiness now, maybe from the meds or the weeks of hunger and exhaustion. But buried deep behind that mist was the gaze Elias remembered. The same look that once held him steady in the middle of a war zone. Elias slipped his hand through the bars, the hand that once gripped a rifle, the hand that used to thump against armored chest plates when calling out, "Good job, Shadow." That same hand now trembled. Shadow pressed his nose against it. Slowly, gently. A sound rose up, not quite a bark, more like a soft whimper, like air escaping from a place it had been trapped too long. Elias sank to his knees. For the first time in 3 years, the name Shadow was spoken aloud with a real voice, not in dreams, not through old recordings of training sessions played over and over in the dead of night. And in that exact moment, the tail moved. Not fast, not strong, just one slow wag. But it was enough to close every distance between them. A staff member came rushing over, voice tight with alarm. "Sir, please, don't get close to him. He's aggressive." But Elias never took his eyes off Shadow. He spoke only one sentence. "Number this is Shadow. And Shadow isn't aggressive. He's just been waiting for me to come back." The woman opened her mouth to say something more, but the words caught in her throat. She saw the way Shadow leaned his head against the bars, saw the look in those eyes. And in that moment, there was nothing left to deny. This wasn't a random reunion. This was a return. A memory once buried deep, now rising summoned back by a single bark. On the way home, the rain began to fade. Sunlight peeked through the canopy, scattering across the windshield like old memories flickering back to life. The old pickup jolted over potholes, but Shadow didn't move. He sat calmly in the passenger seat. No leash, no collar, no command, just that same spot right beside Elias, as if those 3 years apart had never happened. Elias glanced over. There was a small new scar along Shadow's flank. The fur was uneven there, the skin a little darker. Elias didn't ask. He just reached out, placed a hand on Shadow's head, gave one slow rub, and whispered, "Let's go home." The wooden gate creaked open. The little house hadn't changed. Leaves still blanketed the porch. The tomato vines had dried. The old stainless steel bowl still sat by the back steps, now covered in a thin layer of dust. Shadow stepped down from the truck, not in a rush. His paws met the ground, then paused. He lifted his head and looked around at every corner, every crooked gardening fork still stuck in the soil, every uneven stepping stone he had once slipped on as a pup. Elias opened the door. Shadow walked in. No hesitation. No fear. Just slow steps, like retracing the map of his own memory. To the right was the kitchen, where Elias used to pour breakfast kibble each morning. To the left, the sun-bleached wooden couch where Shadow once laid his chin while Elias watched the news. Deeper inside, by the fireplace, sat the same gray rug, still a bit frayed, still marked with the faint scratch of old nails. Shadow made his way there. He sniffed all around, then sat. Not whining, not curling up. Just sitting. As if asking the room itself, "Is this still home?" Elias stood in the doorway, eyes locked on the scene. He didn't need to say anything. That image, the silhouette of a German shepherd sitting in the same exact spot, said more than words ever could. Night fell. Elias placed a clean bowl of water beside the rug and dusted off the old food dish. He warmed up dinner and set it down. Shadow ate slowly, not with the desperation of a stray, but not with the calm of the old days either. Every bite felt deliberate, as if he were tasting each one just to make sure. This wasn't a dream. Elias straightened the blanket and turned on the little radio on his nightstand. Not music, but something older. A canine training recording, lesson 17. The speaker's voice rang out, crisp and familiar. "Shadow, sit. Good boy." And right on cue, the sound of Shadow's bark played through the speaker, clear as daylight, captured years ago. But the real Shadow didn't bark. He just lifted his head, ears twitching slightly. After a long pause, Shadow got up, hopped onto the bed without asking, without hesitation. He leaned his back into Elias's leg and let out a long, tired sigh. Elias gave a soft chuckle. "Yeah, same spot as before." Before falling asleep, Elias glanced down at his feet. Shadow was curled tightly, eyes closed, but ears still tilted upward, always listening. Just like that final night before their last mission in Kandahar. Only difference now, Shadow wasn't going anywhere. The first 3 nights passed in calm, unspoken peace. But on the 4th, something shifted. At 3 a.m, Elias jolted awake. Not from a dream, but from the sound of soft footsteps. Not human. The light tapping of claws on hardwood, steady and unhurried. As if someone were patrolling the house. Elias sat up without turning on the light. Moonlight spilled through the sheer curtain, casting a pale streak across the floor. And there was Shadow, standing at the living room window. Silent. Ears up. Eyes wide. Elias didn't speak. He moved slowly, careful not to startle him. That posture wasn't relaxed. Shadow's neck was slightly extended, nose twitching, tail motionless. Elias knew that stance. He had seen it just before a raid. Every time Shadow stood like that, it meant something was off. "Shadow," Elias called quietly. Shadow didn't turn. He stepped forward, pressing his nose to the glass. Outside, everything was still. The old wooden fence, the bare peach trees near the front. No movement, no sound. But Shadow didn't blink. Elias came closer and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Shadow flinched, then exhaled sharply, not in fear, but like he'd just released a breath he'd been holding far too long. Then he turned his head, nudged his muzzle into Elias's hand, and followed him back to the bedroom without resistance. The next morning, Elias went out earlier than usual, not because of suspicion, but because of that feeling, the one soldiers never forget, that survival instinct. The back door was still locked, the fence untouched, but the patch of soil beneath the second peach tree had been disturbed, just a little. Not enough for most to notice. But Elias noticed. It was a sign. That afternoon, Shadow didn't nap. Every few hours he returned to the window, checking again and again. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. But each time he came back in, his steps were slower. His tail no longer gave those small, hopeful wags like before. By midnight, when Elias turned on the radio like he did every night, Shadow wasn't curled at the foot of the bed anymore. He was sitting upright, facing the door that led to the porch. Not a sound came from him, but his eyes once again were not the eyes of a dog at rest. They were the eyes of a soldier, waiting for orders. Elias sat up, grabbed his jacket, and walked out onto the porch. Shadow moved beside him, silent and steady. The yard was still, wind brushing through the trees, the faint rustle of dry leaves the only noise in the air. But Shadow remained frozen in place, muscles tight. Then suddenly, his ears twitched. His gaze shifted toward the far left corner of the yard. Elias hadn't even turned to look when Shadow stepped forward. Just one step. No lunging. No growl. He simply positioned himself between Elias and the dark, blocking the path. "Is someone out there?" Elias whispered. Shadow didn't respond, but his ears stayed locked, eyes focused like twin searchlights scanning the shadows. For the first time, Elias didn't just feel something was off. He knew. Someone out there was watching them. That afternoon, soft golden sunlight poured across the wooden porch behind the house. Elias stepped out with a brush in one hand and a cloth in the other, and sat on the old, creaky chair. He laid the cloth gently across his knees and gave a small wave. Shadow came out quietly, easing down onto his side beside him. His eyes were half closed, and his tail gave a soft, familiar wag, like this moment, this ritual of calm, had become his new normal. No more explosions, no more commands. There were only slow, silent strokes of peace. Elias began brushing from the back, moving gently along the spine. Shadow's thick coat was a mix of ash gray and scattered white strands, weathered by time. With every tuft of fur that stuck to the cloth, Elias smoothed it down again, not just to untangle it, but as if he were slowly unraveling the past. Then Elias reached the underside. His hand froze. Beneath the soft, matted fur, a scar emerged, harsh, jagged, wrapped around the torso like something had once bound him. Maybe a chain, maybe a shock collar. The skin there had thickened, darkened, and become patchy in places as though burned or infected long ago. Elias didn't move. He just stared, heart tightening in his chest. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't make a sound, didn't turn his head, didn't raise a paw in protest. He just lay there, still and silent. But after a while, as if sensing Elias's pause, Shadow slowly tilted his head. His eyes, the same eyes that had once faced down fire and sand, glanced sideways. No fear, no blame, only a quiet look, as if to say, "It's okay now." Elias bit down hard on his lip. He gently brushed aside the fur near Shadow's left shoulder. Another mark surfaced, thinner but deep. It looked like the lash of a whip, or something sharp dragged across skin. On his neck, just below the edge of the ear, was a patch of rough, darkened skin. The fur there was gone. Elias touched it lightly. It felt like something had clamped down on that spot for a very long time. Shadow didn't flinch. He just breathed, slow and steady. His whole body was soft, resigned, like this was just another part of him now, something he had grown used to carrying. Elias dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Shadow. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply pulled the dog closer, holding tight around the neck that had once been muzzled, the back that had once caught bullets, and the chest that still bore scars. The breeze stirred under the porch awning. The cloth slipped from Elias's knee to the floorboards. And then the ache inside him surged up, not like a cry, not like tears, but like a whisper stuck in his throat. "Where have you been all this time, Shadow?" There was no answer, just the steady, warm breath of a dog who had somehow made it home. And in that breath, Elias felt it, the old trust, still alive, still there, despite the wounds. He picked up the old stainless steel bowl, wiped it clean, filled it with fresh water, and set it beside Shadow's paw. "What do you say we sleep out here tonight?" he said, his voice softer than usual, like he was talking to a child. Shadow didn't bark. He just rested his chin on Elias's leg and closed his eyes. As the sun dipped behind the trees, their shadows stretched long across the porch, one man, one dog. And in that quiet space, something unspoken passed between them, a truth that needed no explanation, just presence. Night fell quicker than usual. Elias sat at his small desk inside, the warm light of the desk lamp glowing over a worn folder. On its faded cover, a barely legible stamp still remained. Task Force Orion, K9 Division, 42B. From the drawer, Elias pulled out a small USB and plugged it into his laptop. The screen blinked to life. A file popped up. Operation Firedust, final debrief. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked play. The screen filled with the image of scorched land, the golden earth of Kandahar baking under a sun that burned at over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The camera shook slightly. A commander's voice crackled through an earpiece. "Target moving west! Team 2 ready. Deploy K9 first." Then Shadow appeared at the edge of the frame. Black tactical vest. Code 42. B stamped boldly across his back, the leash held in his mouth, his eyes laser-focused, ears standing tall, no barking, no hesitation, just the still, alert posture of a warrior who knew exactly what he was there to do. Elias remembered that moment. Before the blast. Before the blood. When all they had was the blistering wind and the burnt scent of sand threading through every seam of their uniforms. Shadow charged forward, overtaking 3 soldiers who were trying to flank a tattered tent. Then suddenly the siren blared. In that split second, Elias had screamed, "Shadow, fall back!" But Shadow didn't stop, not even for a heartbeat. The camera shook violently. A blinding white flash swallowed the entire frame. Then static. Signal lost. Elias closed the laptop. Not because it hurt, but because he remembered. He remembered the way Shadow had turned to look back at him just a second before the blast. That one look had said everything. No fear, no hesitation. Only one message shining in those eyes. Someone in there needs saving. Elias leaned down and opened a drawer. He pulled out an old photograph. One corner still had a rust-colored stained dried blood that never came out. In the photo, Shadow stood proudly in a dust-strewn field, wearing his K9 vest. Behind him, Elias stood with a weary smile, eyes tired but hand resting firmly on Shadow's head. That photo was taken just days before the final mission. Shadow's head was high, his mouth slightly open like mid-bark, his tail low but gently swaying, as if saying, "Don't worry, I've got you." Elias pressed the photo to his forehead and closed his eyes. Beside him, Shadow lay stretched across the floor, breathing steadily. No more vests, no more commands, but in every movement the instinct remained, ready to give everything to protect the one he loved. Elias looked at him not as a dog who had vanished 3 years ago, but as a brother in arms who had somehow come back from a place no one returns from. A deep breath filled Elias's lungs. No more nightmares. No more asking, "Why, Shadow?" Because now, Elias finally understood. In those fleeting moments between life and death, some souls don't need orders. They only need love. The next morning, the sky was quiet and blue. Elias carefully placed the collar back around Shadow's neck. It had been cleaned and polished, the rust scrubbed away. The number 42B was still faintly engraved. Then he leaned down, gave a little pat, and whispered, "Let's go for a walk." The western park on the edge of town was just as quiet as always. Fallen leaves blanketed the stone path. A few children ran across the grass, playing tag. An older man sat on a bench reading the paper. A place where nothing seemed urgent anymore. Shadow walked close to Elias without a leash. He didn't need one. Each step was slow, firm, and mindful, as if he was still listening. To the world, to the wind, to whatever might come. When Elias stopped in front of the little cafe by the lake, Shadow lay down right beside the door, his back to the street, eyes wide open. He wasn't resting. He was guarding. Elias settled onto a stone bench with a hot coffee in hand, his gaze drifting toward the playground across the way. Sunlight filtered through the trees, falling in broken patches that pulsed like breath. Everything felt peaceful, until the sound of breaking glass cracked through the stillness. In a far corner of the park, a middle-aged man was shouting, one hand gripping a glass bottle. His voice was harsh, his posture threatening. The woman next to him stepped back, shielding a crying child in her arms. Before Elias could react, Shadow was already on his feet. No barking, no growling. Just a silent sprint forward, placing himself squarely between Elias and the commotion. His body locked tight, head lowered, eyes sharp. Then came a low snarl, quiet but unmistakable. Anyone who'd ever been to war would recognize it instantly. It was the stance of a warrior ready to fight. The man froze. He didn't take another step. His hand, clenched around the bottle, began to tremble, then loosened. The bottle slipped from his fingers and clinked onto the stone walkway. Elias stood up fast and moved forward. Shadow didn't budge. He stood like a silent wall, holding the line between danger and peace. "Shadow," Elias said gently. "It's okay now." Shadow flicked his eyes to Elias, as if to ask, "Are you sure?" Only then did he back away, slowly, returning to Elias's side. No need for a treat, no command, no praise, just the knowledge that the person he was meant to protect was safe. On the way home, Elias kept looking at Shadow. But it wasn't the look of a pet owner. It was the look of someone who had once stood on the knife's edge between life and death, and understood what that quiet stare meant. Shadow didn't react to strangers. He didn't chase out of instinct. He only moved when real danger appeared. That instinct hadn't faded. He was still Shadow the combat dog trained to run toward the threat, not away from it. Only now, the danger didn't come from a battlefield. It was something else, something getting closer. That night, Elias returned to the old training room. He cleared it out, tossed the broken rails, pulled down the faded signs, and on the main wall he hung a new photograph. Shadow, no vest, no gear, lying peacefully in a field of grass, the light stretching gently across his face. Beneath it, Elias had written a simple line in black ink. "You don't have to be ready anymore. Now you just get to stay." Shadow lay beside the window. His eyes closed, but his ears still listened. Because maybe that instinct never really went to sleep. That morning, rain tapped gently against the tin roof. Not loud, just soft enough to feel like the world was being washed clean. Elias woke earlier than usual, not for anything urgent, just a quiet pull in his chest like someone had whispered through a dream. "It's time." He walked straight to the old storage room behind the garage. In the far corner sat a weathered steel chest, its rusted latch clinging to a rotting wooden shelf. Elias brushed away the dust and opened it. A wave of old paper and damp metal filled the air, dragging up a memory he hadn't touched in years. Inside, mission records, discharge papers, photos from the field, and one thick gray folder marked in bold, K9, code 42B. Elias's hand paused. He opened the file and began turning pages. Every detail was familiar training specs, reflex indexes, operation logs. Each line was a stamp across his memory. Every mission, every drill, every night he'd sat beside Shadow, his hand running down that warm, steady back, like checking the rhythm of his own heart. He flipped to the last page, the section labeled Operational Status. His eyes stopped. There was no KIA, no killed in action, no certificate, no closure. Only one phrase stared back at him. MIA, missing in action. A chill ran down his spine. Elias stared at the letters, afraid that if he blinked, they might disappear. For 3 years, Elias had carried a quiet, aching truth, believing Shadow had died. That the dog who leapt into danger to save him didn't survive. That the cost of living had been losing the one soul who never left his side. But now, right here, in this folder of silent words, was something no one ever told him. Shadow had never been confirmed dead. The past surged through him like the dust of Kandahar, choking everything in its path. He remembered. After the blast, they rushed him into surgery. He was unconscious for 2 days, and when he finally woke up, the first person he saw was a young nurse. Her voice had been almost too gentle to hear. "Mr. Granger, I'm sorry. Shadow didn't make it." That was it. No report, no memorial. No one ever returned Shadow's collar, code 42B, the one Elias had always believed would be placed in his hands as a final goodbye, just one sentence, and he had believed it. Now, staring at MIA, burned into that page, Elias felt something snap inside, not anger, but a question that had never been answered. Where had Shadow been all this time, and why? Did no one ever go looking? Where had Shadow been? Who kept him? And why? Elias clutched the file, flipping through it over and over, eyes scanning every word like a man searching for a hidden code. But that was it. The file ended there. The final page offered no conclusion. No signature, no red government seal, just an unfinished ending. That afternoon, Elias sat on the floor by the window. Shadow curled up beside him again, his big head resting gently on Elias's knee, eyes barely open. Elias set the file down, his hand slowly brushing along Shadow's spine over the scars on his belly, over bones that once jutted through skin like bars on a cage. Then, in a low voice, barely louder than a breath, he murmured, "Shadow, if someone tried to hide this, I'll find out. Not because I'm curious, but because I owe you the truth." That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The warm kitchen light cast soft shadows that danced across the wall. His phone sat on the table. Behind it glowed a name he hadn't said out loud in years, Lieutenant Colonel Reddick. Elias scrolled through his old contacts, hesitated, then pressed call. "Granger?" The voice on the other end was deep and rough, but not unfamiliar. Before Elias could even form a sentence, the man asked again, "You still have the collar? 42B?" Elias froze. "Shadow is alive," he said carefully. "And I have the file. It never said he died." Silence. Then a long, heavy sigh spilled through the speaker, like someone finally setting down a weight they were never supposed to carry. "I know." Reddick told him to wait 5 minutes for a call from a secure line. And right on time, it came this time, video. On screen, Elias saw a face older than he remembered. But the eyes? They were just as sharp as the day they first met at the K9 training base. "I always suspected something," Reddick began. "After the Kandahar incident, I tried to pull Shadow's file, got blocked. The reason they gave? Classified for research delegation." "Sound familiar?" Elias gave a slow nod. "I think Shadow wasn't lost because he failed," he said quietly. "He was taken because he was too good." Reddick tapped a few keys. A classified document popped up on the screen. Elias spotted an unfamiliar logo in the bottom corner. Virion Dynamics. "That's the name you'll want to remember," Reddick said. "They're a third-party firm. Got clearance to acquire K9 units after deployment, supposedly for behavioral and combat reflex research." "You're saying they sold the dogs?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. "Not officially, but in under 2 years, over 30 high-performance K9s were recalled due to accidents. Not a single one came back. Not a single death certificate." Elias felt it like every nerve in his body was being pulled taut. His pulse hammered against his ribs like a war drum of rage. "Virion filed for Pentagon funding under this phrase, K9 Behavioral Analysis for AI Combat Application. Sound familiar?" Elias didn't answer. Reddick sent a file. There it was, 42B, Shadow, transferred under Class Delta V. Below it, a faded note. "Reprogram potential non-lethal use only." A dog who didn't die, who wasn't freed, just kept. Not as a living soul, but as a tool. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, tapping hard against the windows like fingers trying to get in. Elias turned off the screen. Sat in the dark. Only the wind and the sound of water filled the room. Shadow lay nearby, eyes closed, his breathing steady, like some quiet metronome of memory. Elias slowly stood, picked the file back up from the table, and turned it over. Nothing on the back. But as the desk lamp cast a slanted beam across the folder's spine, something shimmered an uneven layer of glue near the binding, like a page had been torn out. Elias slipped a thin blade beneath the binding, peeled gently, and out fluttered a small piece of paper. No title, no case number, just a single handwritten line. "Check item VX-D9 transferred October 3rd via Bluebird route." Elias didn't know what VX-D9 meant. But Bluebird route? That rang a bell. It was a secure military transport line, often reserved for black site air transfers or quarantined cargo. He reached for his phone, pulled up an old military intranet login, two-factor authentication password, fingerprint. Nearly 30 minutes passed, fingers scrolling, digging, tracing cold digital trails. Until finally, a single backup file surfaced, buried in a 2020 database leak. VX-D9 appeared on the list. Filed beneath, Canine Behavioral Asset, Subject Delta V Class, Location, Redacted, Handler, NA, no name, no contact, no location. Shadow, officially, belonged to no one. Elias stared at that one line. Location, redacted. The destination erased clean, as if it had never existed. But then something clicked. All the related files shared one consistent prefix at the top of each page, VRN-07, and Reddick had said it, Virion Dynamics. Elias dove into his old inbox, filtering through dusty military communications. Emails from forgotten years, old intel briefings, archived links. Finally, a name surfaced. VRN-07, Texas facility, Ridgeview sector. A speck of a compound wedged in the dry highlands of western Texas, just east of a decommissioned mining site. No signage, no public records, no access. But then Elias remembered 3 months ago, he'd skimmed a short article buried on a local news site. Residents report barking and metallic clanging from Ridgeview mine officials declined to comment. His hand slammed the desk. The pieces snapped into place like scattered memories finally falling back into alignment. Near midnight, Elias stepped out the back door. The wind was sharp, the dry scent of prairie grass mixed with a faint trace of machine oil. Shadow was already there, not waiting to be called, not needing permission, just quietly, firmly, standing beside him. Elias didn't speak. He only reached down and fastened the collar again that faded 42B, still etched along the tag, a worn symbol of something unbreakable. Shadow, looks like it's not time to rest just yet. He popped the trunk, pulled out the file, and set it on the passenger seat. Shadow jumped into the back like it was second nature. No bark, no sound, just his gaze locked on the road ahead. Exactly like that last day in Kandahar, only this time Elias would be the one leading. Not into war, but toward the light of the truth. This time, it wasn't a battlefield Elias was leading Shadow into. It was something even more uncertain than the light of the truth. The night in the small town was unusually still. The wind brushed softly across the back lawn, whispering stories only those who had once lost something could truly hear. In the quiet bedroom, a dim lamp glowed on the nightstand. The ceiling fan ticked softly overhead, and Elias lay still, breathing slow and steady after a long, heavy day. Then a subtle movement. Shadow rose, not in a rush, not with alarm, just standing, calm and alert, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Elias didn't wake immediately, but the shape of Shadow's silhouette, cast on the wall by the soft lamplight, gradually pulled his eyes open. There were no sudden sounds, no clear noise to trigger concern. And yet, something in the air had shifted. He sat up, quiet, reaching for the wool sweater draped over the back of the chair. Shadow hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the front yard, where the night had swallowed every outline and form into its deepening black. Then Elias heard it. Not an engine, not the crunch of tires over gravel. It was something more subtle, a sound hard to describe, like air being sliced, like the faint tremor of rubber slipping quietly over asphalt. A sound designed to stay unnoticed. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The wind tugged lightly at his sweater, and in that exact moment, as the beam of his flashlight swept across the road, he saw it. A white van. No headlights, no license plate. The windows were pitch black, reflecting the beam back like a sheet of frozen water. You couldn't see in, and you couldn't see who, if anyone, was behind the wheel. The van crept by at an unnerving pace, not fast, not loud, just slow enough to avoid suspicion, but slow enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. A feeling crawled across Elias's skin like cold fingers down his spine. He took a step forward, lifting the flashlight to catch the tail of the van, but it had already turned down a side street and slipped behind a line of old willow trees, swallowed by the dark. Elias stood there a long moment, unmoving. Then he turned. Shadow hadn't budged from his place by the front door, still watching, still fixed in the direction the van had gone. He hadn't blinked. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Still Shadow didn't move. His eyes darkened in the low light, not from fear but from recognition. It was as if something old, something buried deep, had been stirred awake. And then a single bark, not loud, not angry, just one. Low, crisp, final, like a signal being sent. Then Shadow sat down, back straight, steady, eyes locked on Elias, waiting for the next move. Elias didn't need to ask. This wasn't a dog reacting to something unfamiliar. It wasn't instinct. It was the calculated stillness of a soldier, not reacting out of fear, but out of recognition. Shadow wasn't sensing danger. Shadow had already identified it. Elias stepped closer and knelt down, resting a hand gently on Shadow's head. The wind outside still moved through the trees, carrying the scent of damp leaves and something deeper. The kind of night air that feels like it remembers things long forgotten. "Something's looking for you, isn't it?" Elias whispered, though it sounded more like he was speaking to himself. Shadow didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly and exhaled, soft and steady, his gaze fixed on the window. The same spot where that strange van's headlights had flashed past. And that's when Elias understood. They weren't just two souls who had once been summoned to the battlefield. They were being called again. But this time, it wasn't by any mission written in orders or filed in records. This time it was something else, something that had lived quietly in the shadows, waiting. And now, their real journey was about to begin. Elias reached for his phone. His fingers trembled slightly. It was well past midnight, but there was no way he could wait for morning. After a few rings, the line clicked. "Granger?" came Reddick's gravelly voice, laced with the rustle of papers in the background. "Reddick, I need to tell you something." Elias told him everything. The white van, the way Shadow froze like stone, that single deep bark that didn't carry anger, only certainty, and most of all, that feeling that something had reached into a layer of memory they'd both tried to bury. There was a brief grunt on the other end, then the sound of typing, rapid and firm, as if Reddick was already chasing down the ghosts Elias had just awakened. "The plates are fake, but traffic cams at the intersections picked it up. We got timestamps and GPS logs. The van's tied to a logistics firm called Trident Axis." Elias squinted, scribbling the name onto a scrap of paper beside him. "Trident used to handle equipment transfers for Virion Dynamics labs down south," Reddick continued. "But here's the odd part. In their bankruptcy records, there's a route that was never disclosed publicly. It's listed as Bluebird Route, and the only name ever attached to that route, Shadow." The line went quiet for a few long seconds. Then Reddick spoke again, lower this time. "Elias, you're not just uncovering the truth," Reddick said slowly. "You're digging into the one thing they've worked the hardest to bury, a lost asset." Elias turned his head. Shadow was lying beside the table, but not asleep. One front leg curled slightly inward, like the ghost of a memory, as if it had once been bound. His eyes stayed open, fixed on a spot in the dark. "And if Shadow really was a loyal partner," Reddick continued, "taken without cause, survived God knows what, and somehow made it back, but never recognized as a veteran, never honored as a dog who served, just treated like some ordinary object." Reddick didn't have to say the rest. They wouldn't let this go. And then came the final line that made Elias feel ice slip down his spine. "To them, Shadow's not a dog anymore. He's classified as a test subject." Elias clenched his fists until the nails pressed deep into his palms. The image of Shadow burned in his mind. Still here. Still breathing. Still part of a truth nobody dared to face. "I'll send you the internal documents," Reddick said, his voice low. "And the name of the man who used to run the DARC program Dog Adaptive Reconditioning Command for K9 units." He paused. "But Elias, once you get involved in this, there's no turning back." The next morning, the sky hung heavy with gray, and a thin mist blanketed the earth. Wind slipped under the eaves and hissed quietly, like something old and waiting. Elias had just poured a cup of coffee when Shadow moved to the window. He didn't bark, didn't glance back, just stood there, motionless, staring out into the backyard. Elias followed his gaze, and his breath caught. There, beside the bushes in a spot completely hidden from the main road, was a tire track. Deep, clear, fresh. Not the kind that comes from someone turning around in a driveway. This was a full stop, like whoever had been there, had parked, waited, watched, then drove away without a sound. Elias walked over. Kneeling down, he brushed away some of the dry grass. Beneath it, something small and copper glinted in the light, a slender wire, the tip slightly curled, wrapped in thin black rubber. Looked like nothing more than a scrap from an old kitchen appliance. He turned it slowly in his fingers, then looked up at Shadow. Shadow was still standing a few feet away, eyes locked on the thing in Elias's hand. That feeling came rushing back, not fear, but a bone-deep alertness, the kind Elias hadn't felt since his time in uniform. Like every nerve in his body had suddenly remembered what it meant to be hunted. From morning until noon, every time Elias even touched his phone, even just to glance at the screen, Shadow would lift his head. Ears perked. And then, silently, move into position right in front of him, not out of habit, but out of instinct. Something old, something awakened, and maybe something coming. He kept staring at the front door, not sniffing, not pacing, just scanning, like he was tuned to something faint and unnatural, as if he'd once been trained to respond to a frequency or signal that didn't belong to this world. Elias pulled up the porch security footage and rewound to 2 nights ago. Timestamp 0017. There it was. A white van drifting past, slow and deliberate. No headlights, no plates. It only appeared for a brief second, lit up by the neighbor's motion sensor across the fence. The next night, same time, same van, same eerie quiet. Elias switched over to the indoor feed. Both times, right when the van passed, Shadow, who had been fast asleep, suddenly rose to his feet, walked straight to the front door, and sat. Didn't bark, didn't pant, not a sound. Just alert, not scared, aware, like something deep inside him had stirred and recognized what no one else could. That afternoon, Elias drove to the local police station with a USB of the footage and the piece of copper wire in his pocket. The desk officer, probably mid-30s, was chewing gum as he half-glanced at the screen. Elias laid out everything: the tire tracks, the van with no license plate, and the strange, unshakable response from Shadow. The officer shrugged. "Probably just some local kids. I mean, who's got the time to stalk a dog in the middle of the night?" Elias didn't respond. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he already knew. From here on out, the answers he needed weren't going to come from people sitting behind desks. On the drive back, a memory surfaced from the very first week of training with Shadow. If a dog like Shadow is still awake, it's because he's already seen something you haven't. That night, Elias stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The steam from the shower fogged up the glass. He reached out, wiped it clean. In the reflection, he didn't see the same man anymore. His eyes weren't lonely now. Because standing behind him, still as a statue, was Shadow, watching him, unmoving, unblinking, and completely focused. He didn't make a sound, but his presence said it all. Shadow was on guard, silent, resolute, tense in that quiet way that says, "I've done this before." It wasn't just about protecting Shadow anymore. Elias knew that now. This wasn't about a missing dog. It was about something bigger, something buried deep under layers of silence, something no one had dared to speak out loud. And now, piece by piece, it was starting to rise, under the weight of instinct, suspicion, and one unbreakable bond. The tiny office was soaked in silence. The only light in the room came from the computer screen, casting a bluish glow across Elias's face. His jaw was tight, his brow furrowed in that deep, steady way that happens when every line on the screen feels like it might open a door or a wound. The document Reddick had sent was labeled in the plainest font. K9, Special Transfer Registry, Class Delta V. Elias scrolled through, each name slicing open old scars that had never really healed, until he reached one. K942B, Maximus. Attached beneath the line was a blurry photo, along with a faint tag. Most recent behavioral reconditioning, trace code 42DX. He clicked. The image expanded slowly, washing his face in pale light. His eyes, already tired, began to turn glassy. The dog in the picture was a German shepherd. Charcoal coat with a silvery burnish, upright ears, eyes sharp and guarded. But the detail that stopped him cold was the scar wrapping clean around the belly, the exact same scar Shadow had carried back from Kandahar. But the name wasn't Shadow. It was Maximus. A heavy stillness took hold of the room. Elias let go of the mouse and lowered his head. His eyes closed. His breath caught. "Maximus," he whispered, the name foreign on a face he'd never forgotten. Something in him twisted. Not just anger, not just grief. It was the eerie sense that someone had stolen a part of Shadow, repackaged it, renamed it, buried it behind sterile documents and clinical labels. But the past doesn't vanish just because it's been renamed. He turned from the screen and opened the bottom drawer of his old filing cabinet. Inside was a weathered field notebook, edges curled from heat and time. Elias flipped through until he found the page he was looking for. Scribbled in his old handwriting were the words, "Verbal reflex cue, handwritten in case of loss, Shadow, search." He didn't hesitate. Elias crouched down, eyes locking on Shadow, who lay just a few steps away. He spoke slowly, clearly. "Shadow, search." There was no immediate movement, but then, like something stirring deep beneath calm water, Shadow lifted his head. His ears twitched low, then stood again. His eyes blinked once, then twice. And they didn't look at the floor or the room. They fixed right on Elias. He didn't move. He didn't bark. But that look, sharp, trained, waiting, was the look Elias had memorized back at the base. It hit like a punch to the chest. He didn't need proof anymore. Elias turned back to the desk, pulled up the file, and opened the edit field under Identifier. He typed K942B, Shadow, then clicked Save. No one has the right to take away the real name of a dog who once saved a life. No one has the right to erase the past with the stroke of a key. Shadow was still here, and Shadow had never forgotten who he was. He had simply been forced to live beneath a name that never belonged to him. Elias sat still for a long moment. The wind outside began to press harder through the cracks in the doorframe, making the window pane tremble with each gust, as if nature itself was whispering a warning that something was getting closer. Some pasts, no matter how deeply buried, know when to rise again, and some memories, no matter how often renamed, are carved deeper than any number or code ever written. Shadow, Unit K942B, was never Maximus. Never. Elias sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the fresh printout Reddick had just sent. The page was thin, but it carried the weight of 3 years of stolen time. One name stood out in the internal roster: Silas Creed, Director of Strategic Operations, Virion Dynamics. Elias's eyes paused at the bottom corner. A small, clean note, but it hit like a blade. Transfer of subject K942B. Custodial rights confirmed, Creed. He didn't need to read further. When he looked up, Shadow was standing by the window, completely still. But his entire body was stretched tight, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. Elias said the name, softly, only once. Creed. Immediately, Shadow turned. There was no barking, no frenzy, just a low, ragged growl so deep it seemed to rise from somewhere buried inside his chest, from a place that hadn't been touched in years. The fur along Shadow's back bristled. His eyes went darker, pupils narrowed and fixed, like he was bracing for something, not shaking but waiting. Watching Elias, not asking for permission. It was something else. A hesitation that looked like a question, tilted ever so slightly in the head, those eyes locked on Elias like they were searching for understanding. Elias stepped closer, hand extended but not touching just yet. He looked into Shadow's eyes. And there, in that depth, was something that couldn't be explained. This wasn't instinct, this wasn't training, it was trauma. He hadn't seen that look in years, not since those early days on base, when Shadow was first learning to tell the difference between a command and a trap. Elias crouched low, his voice soft and steady. "It was him, wasn't it?" Shadow turned immediately. No barking, no snarling, just a deep, guttural growl. It came from somewhere buried far inside him, thick and raw, like it had been sealed away for years, and was finally clawing its way back out. The fur on Shadow's back stood on edge. His eyes darkened, locked onto Elias with an intensity that didn't waver. He didn't tremble. He didn't flinch. He simply waited, posture frozen, not for permission, but for understanding. He tilted his head slightly, studying Elias like he was asking the question without words. Elias stepped closer, reaching out his hand, but stopped short of touching. He looked into Shadow's eyes, and what he saw wasn't just alertness. It wasn't instinct. It was trauma. A look Elias hadn't seen in years. Not since the early days of training at base camp, when Shadow was still learning the difference between a command and a trap. Elias crouched low, his voice soft and steady. "It was him, wasn't it?" Shadow didn't move, but Elias felt it, an unease rising through the silence, that deep, unsettled pull inside, whispering that this wasn't just a memory. It was something still alive. He opened the supplemental file. Under the section labeled Neural Conditioning History, Delta V Subject, one nearly erased line appeared. Subject displays heightened response to verbal trigger Creed, emotional regulation, incomplete. In the corner, a note. Logged by DARC Camp 12, Level B Lab. Elias closed his eyes and pressed his lips together. He had hoped, if Shadow survived, that maybe, just maybe, he had been sent somewhere safe. Some recovery facility, a home. Not left to be poked and wired and broken in a lab coat world where nothing had a name, only a barcode. A dog doesn't get to choose who holds the leash. But now, Shadow was free of leashes. Elias turned his gaze back. Shadow was right there beside the chair, unmoving, eyes pinned on the open file as if he could read every word. And then Elias spoke. Quietly. Not as an order, but as a vow to an old friend. I won't let that name show up in your life again. Not ever. I promise. Shadow lowered his head gently and touched his nose to Elias's leg. It was such a small gesture, but it held the weight of complete trust. And Elias understood. From that moment on, this wasn't just about uncovering a buried memory. This was about reclaiming something sacred. Shadow's name. Shadow's identity. A name that had been erased, stripped from every system, now had to be returned to where it truly belonged, not in the hands of those who had never seen him as a sentient soul. This was no longer a mission. It was a promise. Elias picked up his phone. His voice was low, calm, and final. I need everything you have on Silas Creed. Where he lives, where he moves, and the things he's worked hardest to hide. There was a pause on the other end. Reddick exhaled slowly. Understood. But are you sure? Once this starts, there's no way back. Elias set the phone down, his eyes still locked onto the old file. He didn't need to say a word. His face said everything. Something had shifted inside him. Something deep. Something loud. 3 years. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every syllable landed heavy. For 3 years, Shadow was treated like a tool, while I sat here thinking he was finally at peace. Shadow stepped closer. No bark, no growl, just gently resting his head on Elias's lap, as if to say, I'm still here. Elias placed his hand on Shadow's neck, tracing the scars that coiled cold and long beneath his fur. They weren't just marks. They were questions, left unanswered for far too long. He turned back to the desk and reprinted the file. This time the name at the top was changed by his own hand. Re-identified, K942B = Shadow. Beneath the signature line, Elias added one final sentence. The ink was bold and steady, like a verdict delivered after years of silence. Shadow was detained without justification. It's time he got his name back, and the justice he deserves. Then, quietly, he opened a drawer and took out his old sidearm, the one he swore he'd never use again. But Elias knew now. Some vows are only kept until justice is taken away. Then they become something else entirely. A reason to act. A reason to finish what should never have been started. Shadow stayed curled at Elias's feet, his breathing slow and warm. Elias reached down and placed a hand gently along Shadow's back. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Not ever. The night outside had fallen like a thick curtain, sealing everything beneath a dense stillness. Inside the tiny room, the soft yellow light from the desk lamp spilled into a fading halo across the wooden floor. Elias sat motionless, eyes fixed forward, shoulders tight with resolve. Behind him, Shadow remained alert, his gaze never wavering. They both faced the same direction, toward something invisible, something heavy with the weight of names once buried deep in darkness, now inching toward the light. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Not ever. Outside, the night pressed close, cloaking the small house like a secret kept too long. The faint glow of the lamp stretched a pale streak over the floor, barely enough to make out Elias at his desk. He sat still, a statue in the silence. And just behind him, like a shadow in both name and presence, Shadow stood as if carved from stone, unmoving, unblinking. Not a sound passed between them. Time itself seemed frozen. Wind hissed through the gaps in the doorframe, curling around tree branches and making them creak with voices only the dark could understand. But beneath that silence, something shifted. Shadow wasn't sleeping. Shadow stood rigid by the window, every muscle drawn tight. His tail hung low, his back arched slightly forward, his eyes locked on the pitch-black backyard where nothing moved but the wind through the brush. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. But Elias knew that look. That was the look of a dog who once sensed death from miles away. Elias reached out and turned off the desk lamp. He was headed toward the bedroom when the light above them flickered, then snapped off. No warning, no flicker, just darkness total and sudden. He froze in place. A chill crawled up his spine like a cold hand. He pulled out his phone. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just the blank glow of a screen that read, "No connection." The worry sharpened into something heavier. Elias reached for the emergency flashlight he kept in the stairwell drawer, but before his fingers touched the handle. Clack, clack. A faint metallic sound echoed from the back door. Software precise. Not the wind, not rusted hinges. This was the sound of a tool, of someone picking a lock. Elias stopped breathing. Elias gripped the flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. He stepped down the stairs, slow and silent. Every inch of muscle moved with the precision of a man who had once walked battlefields. His instincts screamed that whoever was on the other side of that door was not just some curious kid. Then came the click. A faint, deliberate snap. The final lock had just been breached. Before Elias could react, a cold rush of air slapped him in the face. Sharp, bitter, laced with a chemical sting, chloroform, or something stronger, designed to drop a man fast, quiet, and clean. He staggered backward, one hand fumbling inside the drawer where his old handgun lay, the weapon he'd sworn he'd never touch again. His fingers brushed the grip just as his head began to spin. His vision blurred. His limbs started to fail him. Footsteps approached, unhurried, confident. No effort to hide. The intruder already knew Elias wouldn't be getting up. And then, in the space between one collapsing breath and the next, a blur of motion. Shadow. Not a sound. No bark. No growl. Just a blur of dark muscle cutting through the room like an arrow let loose from a bow drawn to breaking point. This wasn't instinct. It wasn't animal reflex. This was something else. This was the strike of a soldier, one who had waited 3 long years for the moment to defend the only family he had left. Shadow didn't hesitate, didn't check, didn't falter. In a heartbeat, he was across the room. His paws touched down with the weight of air itself, every sinew flexed tight, a storm in motion, and in the heavy silence, he moved like smoke, invisible, but unstoppable. The intruder was still hunched low, one hand reaching for the weapon at his hip, when Shadow hit. A whisper of breath, a crack like dry bone splitting. Shadow's jaws locked deep into the man's gun arm. A scream tore through the house, bone shattered, blood sprayed across the curtain fabric. The man shrieked, panicked and broken, flailing backward. But Shadow held. His grip never loosened. His power, absolute. This wasn't chaos, it was precision, 1,000 drills condensed into one explosive act. Shadow didn't let go. Not yet. When the intruder hit the ground, Shadow took half a step back but didn't retreat. He stayed right there, planted in front of Elias, spine arched, eyes locked and unblinking. No growl, no bark. Just a fiery gaze that seemed to burn a hole straight through the darkness. It wasn't just anger. It was a warning, a message that needed no translation. Touch Elias, and you won't make it out of here in one piece. The side door rattled. Another shadow slipped into the house, this one quieter, more refined, like someone trained not to be heard. But Shadow had already picked up on it. He turned, shifting smoothly to block the path. His eyes never left the figure. Ears up, breathing tight and measured. Then, just one bark, sharp, clean, and piercing. It cut through the walls like a signal flare, aimed straight at the ears of those waiting outside. Moments later, a storm of footsteps thundered through the yard. The porch light blazed to life, casting the yard in daylight. Flashlights beamed through the windows, sweeping across the room like searchlights. Reddick's voice roared out over the chaos. "FBI! Everybody down! Hands where we can see them!" The quiet little house, once just a shelter from the world, had turned into the epicenter of a tactical raid. Blue and red lights flashed wildly beyond the windows. The door burst open. Officers in full gear poured in. Shadow didn't move. He stayed right where he was, shielding Elias, who now lay on his side near the desk, one hand still gripping the drawer handle, eyes gently closed. Reddick was the first through the door. He saw everything in an instant, and froze. He didn't call out Shadow's name. He didn't shout any commands. He just stood there and looked. He looked at a K-9 soldier no longer enlisted, no longer counted but still fighting like he'd never been given permission to lay down arms. A warrior wrapped in fur, a soul once discarded. And that night, beneath the flare of floodlights and the wail of sirens, no one had any doubts left. Shadow wasn't just living evidence. Shadow was the reason the truth would finally be dragged into the light. A warrior, in the form of a dog the world once chose to forget. And under those swirling lights, that dog had just reminded them all he never forgot who he was. Elias lay unconscious. Right beside him, Shadow stood guard, chest squared over Elias's body, paws planted firm against the wooden floor, muscles rigid, mouth streaked with blood. The two intruders were sprawled across the room. One was out cold. The other groaned in agony, his arm twisted unnaturally where Shadow had broken it, blood spreading across the floor like spilled ink. No one moved. The room hung in stunned silence. Reddick stepped forward and crouched by the wounded man's arm. The bite was deep, strong, but not lethal. He looked up at Shadow, his voice barely a whisper. He knew when to stop. Another officer moved swiftly, pulling items from a black canvas bag. A combat knife, an unregistered handgun, a signal jammer. But what made the entire room hold their breath was a steel nameplate, glinting under the flashlight, etched with a mercenary unit's serial code. This wasn't some petty break-in, one officer murmured. They were trained and sent. Reddick's eyes shifted to Shadow, his face still marked with blood. But those eyes, they burned with clarity, with command. Not the eyes of a frightened animal, but those of a soldier, one doing exactly what he was born to do. Elias stirred. His eyelids trembled, then slowly opened. The first thing he saw was Shadow's eyes, gazing down at him. Shadow had curled beside him, his head resting on Elias's chest, breath calm and steady like the tide. Elias reached up, his fingers brushing the fur along Shadow's back. His voice cracked, heavy with emotion. "You're really here." Shadow didn't move, but something in his body softened, like a weight had finally been lifted after years of silent waiting. Reddick knelt beside them and placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "We just touched something bigger than we thought, and the people keeping it buried won't stay quiet for long." Elias slowly sat up, leaning back against the old wooden chair, his hand still resting gently on Shadow's head, like it was the one solid thing he could hold on to while the world spun out of control. In the dim glow from the flashlight that had rolled under the table for the first time since that explosion years ago, Elias didn't see a damaged creature. He saw a friend, a warrior, a reason to keep going. With his back pressed to the chair and his hand resting on Shadow like a promise, Elias finally understood. Shadow wasn't just a dog. Shadow was what was left of everything worth fighting for. The front door slammed open without warning. In rushed the local police and Reddick's tactical unit, armor-clad and weapons raised, flashlight beams sweeping through the space like searchlights in a battlefield. But as their lights passed over the living room, everyone froze. Elias lay unconscious on the floor. Right over his chest stood Shadow, unmoving. The German Shepherd's body blocked Elias like a living shield. Blood stained the corners of Shadow's mouth. Just feet away, the two intruders were down. One lay completely limp, out cold. The other clutched a shattered arm, moaning in pain. Blood from his wound soaked into the rug, painting it red thread by thread. No one said a word. The room fell into a silence so heavy it chilled to the bone. Only the sound of ragged breathing and stunned disbelief lingered in the air. Reddick stepped closer, crouching beside the groaning mercenary. The bite mark was vicious, deep, and unforgiving, but deliberately placed. It missed any artery or fatal spot. Reddick exhaled, casting his eyes toward Shadow, murmuring almost to himself. He knew when to stop. Another officer opened a tactical bag left behind. Inside were items that made every stomach turn: a military-grade dagger, an untraceable handgun, a mobile signal jammer, and a professional lock-picking kit. But it was the last item that turned the room to stone. A cold steel nameplate, the kind worn only by contract soldiers. Its numbers were engraved deep, no mistake about what kind of men these were. A young officer broke the silence. These weren't burglars. Someone paid them to come here. Shadow hadn't moved. He stood like a statue carved from instinct and memory. His eyes were locked onto the man writhing in pain, not with hatred, not with fear. Just a calm, measured stare. The stare of a protector who had waited too long for this moment. Elias stirred. At first, his vision was blurry, swimming in the low light. But he could feel warmth pressed against him like a heartbeat outside his own body. Shadow's head rested softly on his chest. His breath slowed, rhythmic, steady. A quiet signal in the chaos, whispering, "It's over now." Elias raised his hand, his fingers finding the thick fur at the back of Shadow's neck. He ran his hand along the coat, warm, soft, and trembling slightly beneath his touch. It was real. So was the moment. Like his own pulse, coming back to him. "You're really here." No more words were needed, no explanation, just that feeling. Shadow hadn't left, Shadow hadn't turned away, and in that moment, Elias knew something had returned. Not a memory, but a vow, a promise made in dust and gunpowder, now alive again in breath, in muscle, in unshakable loyalty. Reddick knelt beside them, his expression softening, voice low. "This isn't just your story anymore, Elias. They know you still have him. And trust me, they will come back." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't argue, didn't show fear. He simply nodded. One hand still resting on Shadow's head, the other curling slightly, firm and quiet like a vow pressed into skin. A promise without words, and a line no one would be allowed to cross again. Outside, sirens howled in steady pulses. Red and blue lights flashed endlessly across the window pane. But inside that small room, only two figures remained in silence. A soldier who once forgot who he was, and a dog who had once been written off as worthless. Elias leaned down, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke into Shadow's ear. "You're not alone anymore, and this time, no one has to run." The next morning arrived with a sky so clear it felt untouched. The forest breeze drifted softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. Elias walked with Shadow along the narrow trail that wound through the woods, the same one they always followed after everything felt too much. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, dancing in golden shards across the moss-covered ground. Everything seemed quiet, peaceful even. But Shadow wasn't behaving like usual. There was no joyful trot, no nose twitching at every squirrel or leaf. His steps were low and measured, tense. His ears stayed pricked. His tail hung down. His eyes kept darting toward the left, toward something unseen. At a bend in the trail, where the grass grew high enough to brush Elias's knees, he tugged gently on the leash to guide Shadow forward. But Shadow stopped, locked eyes on a thick clump of underbrush to the side. Then, without hesitation, Shadow lunged forward, dragging Elias with sudden force. "Shadow!" Elias hissed, trying not to shout, but when he caught the look in Shadow's eyes, he went quiet. It wasn't fear he saw. It was recognition, a look that said something was here, something important. Elias followed without another word, pushing branches aside as they moved deeper into the overgrowth. Only a few paces in, and then there it was. A rusted steel hatch, half buried in the earth, swallowed by moss, leaves, and time itself. Shadow didn't bark. He simply stepped forward, placed one paw on the lid, and turned to Elias as if to say, "Here. This is it." Elias slowly knelt beside him, brushing away layers of damp dirt. His hand hit cold metal. The moss peeled back, revealing an old, corroded iron handle. From his backpack, Elias pulled out the pry bar he now carried everywhere since the night their house was breached. He wedged the tip beneath the edge of the hatch, drew in a breath, and pushed down with all his strength. Kirk! The sound of metal creaking echoed sharply through the trees. A cloud of dust burst into the air, thick with the stench of rust, mildew, and something long decayed. Together, Elias and Shadow stared down into the opening. They couldn't see where it led, only darkness. A narrow path, sinking deep into the earth. Elias reached over, resting his hand on Shadow's head. "We found it. The door to the past. And this time, no one's getting buried in it again." Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. He just stood there, silent, waiting for Elias to take the next step. Below them, the bunker waited. And with it, the truth is finally ready to be called by its rightful name. Inside the bunker, the air was heavy and stale, like the weight of years pressing down on every breath. Elias flicked on his flashlight, its dim beam slicing through the darkness, barely enough to reveal the edges of the room. Shadow stayed close, never more than a step behind, his eyes constantly scanning, alert to even the faintest sound. Each footstep echoed along the concrete floor, cold and unwelcoming. The silence clung to them like fog. They turned a corner and found them a pile of old documents, some labeled with red stamps. DARC confidential. Not government, not military, something hidden, something that had never wanted to be found. Next to the papers were black and white photographs, weathered and torn, but unmistakable. In one of them, Shadow, back when they called him Maximus, was chained with heavy iron links. His muzzle was bloodied, his eyes wide open in agony, begging for help. Elias's breath caught. His knees gave out and he sank to the floor. His hands trembled as he lifted the photo. His lips were dry, his voice brittle. "They tortured you for 3 years. Is that true?" Shadow stepped forward. No growling, no barking. He just rested his head gently on Elias's shoulder, a quiet gesture that said everything. "You're not alone." Elias kept searching. His fingers brushed over a small notebook wedged between files. He flipped it open and froze. Pain threshold testing. Subject K942B. Exhibits high resistance to sedation. Increase shock pulse frequency. A line of words that reads more like a war crime than medical research. His eyes burned. He pulled the metal box closer, the one labeled Silas Only, and held it tight against his chest like a lifeline. Not just evidence now. This was testimony. Shadow wasn't just a victim. Shadow was a living witness to a hidden system of cruelty, cloaked in silence and sealed behind doors no one dared open. He didn't need to wonder anymore. He knew exactly what needed to happen next. This couldn't stay buried. This couldn't be forgotten. He clenched the box in both hands, as if it held the weight of everything that had ever been silenced. Elias looked at Shadow, who stood quietly at his side, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself feel the strength of that presence. Shadow didn't say a word, but his head lowered onto Elias's knee, soft and steady, a quiet offering of strength, a silent promise. And in that moment, Elias made one too. No more hiding, no more secrets. No matter the cost, this truth, Shadow's truth, was going to be seen. Elias grabbed his phone without hesitation and called Reddick, the one man he trusted to do this the right way. Not with rage, but with justice. His voice was hoarse, trembling slightly, but steady in its resolve. "I have everything," he said. "The documents, the photos, the hard drive. I need your help to bring this out. The right time, the right way." On the other end, Reddick was silent for a few moments. Then his voice came through, calm and low. "Send me your location. I'll be there." Elias looked down at Shadow. His eyes were tired, but they held something steady now, something deeply anchored. "They erased your name like you were just some number, but memories can't be deleted. And now I'll make sure the world knows your real name." He carefully packed the files, photos, and hard drive into his backpack, zipping it shut with quiet finality. With one last glance around the bunker, Elias and Shadow stepped out into the morning air. The heavy steel door slammed behind them, sealing away the shadows of what had been. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Sunlight broke through the treetops and poured across their path as they walked side by side, step by steady step, toward what came next. Elias leaned toward Shadow, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking to the part of himself that had stayed silent for too long. Silence helped them bury the truth, but now the truth has teeth. Morning sun streamed between the city buildings as Elias and Shadow made their way into the heart of Tucson, Arizona. The desert heat was sharp, dry, and unforgiving, so different from the cool forests they once called home. But inside Elias, something hotter burned. A fire that had never gone out. He looked down at Shadow again, his tone firm but soft. Silence helped them hide everything before. But not anymore. The truth bites now. They stopped outside a nondescript building, modest, quiet, almost forgettable. But this was it. The place where Silas Creed, whose real name was Jason Rohr, now worked under a new identity, disguised as a small-time security consultant. This was the thread they had chased across years, the man behind it all. Their final lead. In a small, windowless FBI outpost, the glow of a computer screen lit Elias's face as he scanned the latest file Reddick had sent. Page after page revealed the trail of Jason Rohr's double life, from daily routines to financial ties to the shell companies that masked deeper secrets. Elias read each line slowly, eyes narrowing with every discovery. Every timestamp, every address, every unfamiliar name could be a missing piece. He traced the patterns with his fingertip, connecting dots that led back not just to Shadow's past, but to something bigger, something built to stay hidden. But not anymore. Before they stepped into the final chapter, Elias took a moment to prepare with care. He checked Shadow's leash and adjusted the collar that still bore the old serial number. It fit snugly around Shadow's neck, like a memory that refused to fade. Elias looked deep into Shadow's eyes. Those eyes were calm, unwavering, and free of fear even after all they'd endured. Memories surfaced like flickering reels from a long-forgotten film, grueling training drills at the base, long nights on hostile ground, the countless times Shadow had hurled himself into danger just to shield Elias from death itself. Those eyes had seen war, betrayal, and survival. And now they spoke a silent promise. Whatever was coming, it would not be like before. Despite the tension pulling tight in his chest, Elias felt a fire building inside. This confrontation with Silas wouldn't be easy. The man was cunning and dangerous and hid truths that could reshape both their lives forever. Their vehicle rolled quietly out of the FBI station, gliding through Tucson's empty streets. Shadow lay still on the back seat, but his ears remained perked, tuned in to every murmur, every creak of the quiet neighborhoods they passed. His instincts were fully awake. Ready. Elias glanced back, a warmth blooming in his chest. He whispered softly, "We're going to get justice, Shadow. You're not alone anymore." Sunlight filtered through the windshield, laying golden streaks across the dusty road. That afternoon, the sky over Georgia wore a heavy ash-gray veil, as if even the sun was too tired to shine down on a land that had endured too much pain. A breeze drifted through the worn rooftops, carrying the faint scent of gasoline from the small garage at the end of the street, where Elias Granger stood with his head bowed, hands stained with motor oil, and eyes hollow, like a man still trapped on some distant battlefield. 3 years had passed. 3 years since Elias was airlifted out of the blast zone in Kandahar. And 3 years since they told him that Shadow the K-9, trained from puppyhood to serve by his side, hadn't survived. They said no body was found. They said the explosion was too powerful. They said it was best to leave everything buried out there. But Elias never did. Every night, after the garage lights went dark and the small wooden house at the end of the road fell into silence, Elias kept one ritual alive. He placed a wooden photo frame beside his pillow. Inside was a weathered picture, its edges faded by night fog. In it, Elias stood in uniform, his arm around Shadow the proud German shepherd in a ballistic vest, ears alert, head high, and eyes that stared ahead with a courage that no fire could bend. "He wasn't a dog," Elias once said to a friend. "He was the only teammate who ever ran into flames just to pull me out. No hesitation, no questions." In Elias's world, some things simply couldn't be replaced. And Shadow was one of them. By the window, the gray shag rug remained untouched where Shadow used to curl up after patrol. The stainless steel water bowl still sat beside it, though it had long been dry and silent. And hanging quietly from the coat hook on the wall, a black collar with faded engraving. Shadow, K9, 42B. Elias had never taken it down. He never brought home another dog. Someone once asked why. Elias simply said, "Because he's still here." That afternoon, as the skies darkened with rain, Elias sat alone on the old wooden chair out on the porch. The rain hadn't come yet, but the air had turned damp and cold. From his shirt pocket, he pulled out a weathered keychain with a brass name tag. It was once attached to Shadow's armor, the only thing recovered from the explosion. Elias turned it slowly in his fingers, then pressed it against his chest, a silent habit no one was around to see anymore. He didn't cry. The old soldier had endured more loss than most could ever fathom. But in his eyes was something sharper than tears, a quiet emptiness, deep and unmoving. In Elias's mind, Shadow's bark still echoed through the nights. Sometimes a warning growl, sometimes the excited howl when the kennel door creaked open. And some nights, Elias would jolt awake, heart racing, from a dream of a leap, a lick to the hand, one more look into those soulful eyes. But every morning the house stayed as quiet as before, and Shadow's resting place remained empty. Elias had no idea that just a few blocks away, behind the rust-stained bars of a kennel at the Jefferson County Rescue Shelter, another soul was lying still beneath the soft tapping of rain on the corrugated roof. A creature marked by a long scar down its ribs, and a memory that never stopped aching. Shadow was curled tightly, his body pressed into the coldest corner of the cage. His eyes weren't fully shut, nor wide open. They hovered somewhere in between, just enough to track every dim movement beyond the mesh. Not because he was afraid, but because sleep had never felt safe. The breeze slipped through a crack in the door, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and old metal. Shadow sniffed once, gently lifting his head. It wasn't food. It wasn't a stranger. It was something older than either of those, like ash buried in memory, like the faint, bitter scent of spent gunpowder clinging to the past. Beneath his belly lay a thin layer of cloth, once part of an old bedsheet. The staff called it his new bed. But nothing felt new to Shadow when his mind was still chained to somewhere else. The first night he arrived, Shadow barked, not to scare anyone, but to call out. No one understood. They shook their heads and scribbled in their reports. They labeled him unpredictable, wrote down the words PTSD, high risk, unsuitable for contact. No one noticed how he panted in his sleep, his legs twitching with memories of running. No one saw the flicker in his eyes every time a man's footsteps echoed down the hall. There was no panic in that look, no joy either, only waiting. Because deep in Shadow's memory lived the face of a man who once held him close after every firefight, a man who pressed his hand gently to the top of his head and whispered, "Good job, old boy." A man who once stood in a desert, thunderous with gunfire, and said, "If I die, I want to die beside you." Then came the explosion. Then blood. Then chaos, the blur of lights, the metallic clang of shattered gear, the roar of helicopters overhead, the sting of burning powder still hanging in the air. And then, nothing. Shadow couldn't remember how he made it out. He didn't know who pulled him from the rubble. What he did remember was the silence. No more Elias, no more steady hand, no more voice calling his name, Shadow 42B, like a promise wrapped around survival. From that moment on, it was just a blur of cages and strange faces. Sometimes they tied him up. Sometimes they shoved him into overcrowded pens where the hunger was louder than the barking. Sometimes people reached out to touch him. Shadow growled. Not out of violence. But because if it wasn't Elias, he didn't want to be touched again. This rainy afternoon, Shadow made no sound. He didn't bark. He just lay still. But his ears lifted. His eyes opened a little wider. Somewhere, far off, a sound broke through the hush. It was familiar, faint but unmistakable. The rumble of an old engine straining against the rain. A sound he remembered from the days riding back to base beside Elias. The slow crunch of tires on wet gravel. The squeak of a car door opening. Footsteps. And a rhythm that his memory still knew by heart. A familiar shape, large yet frail, was curled up in the corner of the kennel. The ears were pinned back, the body still. But the moment those footsteps echoed down the hall, the figure sprang up like a coiled spring finally released. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time forgot how to move. Elias stepped back half a pace, His lips parted, but no words came out. Shadow. Shadow's forelegs froze mid-step on the cold concrete floor. He didn't bark, didn't run. He just stood there, staring at the face in front of him, the face once smeared in blood and desert dust, the face Shadow had believed was lost forever on foreign ground. Elias stepped closer. Slowly. His hand trembled as he reached for the kennel door. "Is that Shadow?" No command, no call, no cue, but Shadow moved forward. No hesitation, no growl, just a quiet press of his muzzle into the center of Elias's open palm. A sound escaped, not loud, just the gentlest hush, like wind slipping through leaves. But it was enough. Elias knew that sound, a shallow breath. Shaken, his knees gave way. He sank to the floor, his hands meeting the ground. "Old boy, is it really you?" A tail brushed against his hand, then swayed again, soft and slow. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias wept. Not the cry of a soldier, but the cry of a man who had lost the most precious part of his soul, only to find it returned. Shadow had rarely barked, not since arriving at the Jefferson shelter. Every day passed in silence, filled only with the sigh of wind between the bars and the steady march of military boots pacing by. But that day, Shadow barked. Not without reason, just one bark. Low, hoarse, like the echo of a bell rung long ago in a place scorched by sun and heavy with the scent of gunpowder. Elias was setting a donation bag on the front counter when his whole body tensed. He didn't even think. He just turned instinctively, eyes locked on the hallway behind the reception desk. It was just one bark. But Elias knew that sound like he knew his own heartbeat. He had heard it in the freezing nights of Kandahar when Shadow caught the scent of buried mines, when Shadow warned of strangers, when Shadow charged through smoke and fire straight toward him. Elias didn't say a word. He just moved. No one had to guide him. He didn't ask for directions. He walked like someone who had already left pieces of his soul in that place. The hallway to the kennels was dim, the flicker of weak fluorescent lights painting the floor in patches. The air was thick with the sharp bite of disinfectant and the musky weight of wet dogs. Most people would wrinkle their nose. Elias felt nothing but the pounding in his chest. He stopped at the third kennel from the end. Everything went still. Inside sat a creature, large, thin, one ear folded down, back slightly hunched from an old injury, and the eyes, those eyes. Elias stepped closer. His hand reached for the bars. "Shadow?" No movement. Elias drew in a slow breath. His voice dropped, gentler now. "It's me." No growl. None of the defensive reactions the staff had warned about. Just a slow, deliberate shift. Shadow lifted his head, tilted it, then moved closer to the front of the cage. His eyes weren't as clear as before. There was a cloudiness now, maybe from the meds or the weeks of hunger and exhaustion. But buried deep behind that mist was the gaze Elias remembered. The same look that once held him steady in the middle of a war zone. Elias slipped his hand through the bars, the hand that once gripped a rifle, the hand that used to thump against armored chest plates when calling out, "Good job, Shadow." That same hand now trembled. Shadow pressed his nose against it. Slowly, gently. A sound rose up, not quite a bark, more like a soft whimper, like air escaping from a place it had been trapped too long. Elias sank to his knees. For the first time in 3 years, the name Shadow was spoken aloud with a real voice, not in dreams, not through old recordings of training sessions played over and over in the dead of night. And in that exact moment, the tail moved. Not fast, not strong, just one slow wag. But it was enough to close every distance between them. A staff member came rushing over, voice tight with alarm. "Sir, please, don't get close to him. He's aggressive." But Elias never took his eyes off Shadow. He spoke only one sentence. "Number this is Shadow. And Shadow isn't aggressive. He's just been waiting for me to come back." The woman opened her mouth to say something more, but the words caught in her throat. She saw the way Shadow leaned his head against the bars, saw the look in those eyes. And in that moment, there was nothing left to deny. This wasn't a random reunion, this was a return. A memory once buried deep, now rising summoned back by a single bark. On the way home, the rain began to fade. Sunlight peeked through the canopy, scattering across the windshield like old memories flickering back to life. The old pickup jolted over potholes, but Shadow didn't move. He sat calmly in the passenger seat. No leash, no collar, no command, just that same spot right beside Elias, as if those 3 years apart had never happened. Elias glanced over. There was a small new scar along Shadow's flank. The fur was uneven there, the skin a little darker. Elias didn't ask. He just reached out, placed a hand on Shadow's head, gave one slow rub, and whispered, "Let's go home." The wooden gate creaked open. The little house hadn't changed. Leaves still. Nightfall in El Paso didn't feel like anywhere else. The air carried a metallic scent, cold and sharp like the edge of a blade, mingled with desert dust, and the muted groans from alleys so narrow they didn't show up on any tactical map. At the far western edge of the city, an abandoned warehouse slouched in silence. Corrugated steel panels sagged overhead, full of holes that spoke of bullets long forgotten. In the distance, a drone blinked faintly, its red light pulsing like the dying heartbeat of something once alive. Somewhere in the dark, a voice crackled over the radio. Low, firm, unflinching. No call for confirmation. No room for mistakes. Kyla Monroe crouched low behind a brick wall, her hand wrapped tightly around a semi-automatic. Next to her, Rook, her jet-black German shepherd, didn't make a sound. Not a growl, not a breath out of place. His eyes locked on the steel door ahead. 3 hostages were inside. And the man behind that door had just warned that in 10 minutes, without ransom, one of them would die. Kayla raised 2 fingers, signaling a silent command. It was a language only she and Rook knew, a language that couldn't be copied, broken, or decoded. There was no backup plan, only one direction to move. Forward. A gust of wind slipped through a crack in the wall, sending a strip of plastic curtain fluttering in the yellow light spilling from a flickering street lamp. Rook didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion he leapt through the gap, silent as a ghost, and vanished through a side door. Kayla counted the rhythm of his footsteps. 3, 2, 1. The first gunshot came from inside, but not from their team. It was the hostage-taker, finger tightening around the trigger aimed at a terrified 9-year-old. But just before that trigger could finish its journey, Rook exploded out of the dark and slammed into his chest, driving him to the ground with brutal precision. In the same instant, Kayla kicked in the door. The lock snapped. She moved like a flash of light. Takedown 1, elbow strike, pivot, second down. Close quarters combat at its purest. No screaming, no begging. Just 17 seconds of cold, flawless violence. When the overhead lights came on, all 3 hostages were safe. 2 criminals lay unconscious. The third was pinned beneath Rook, his eyes wide with something worse than pain. Fear, pure and primitive. Kayla dropped to one knee beside the child, Her hand gently brushed the girl's collar. Her voice, soft as dusk, whispered, "You're safe now. Rook's here." Outside, sirens howled into the dark. A reporter, no one knew from where, snapped a photo just as Rook turned his head, chest heaving, paw pressed on the kidnapper's shoulder like a vow carved in stone. No one dies tonight. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. The Silent Soldier. That's what they called Kayla. And Rook, the decorated K9 with more missions behind him than most soldiers, was hailed as a legend reborn. But beneath the glory, Kayla felt something shift. Not out there, inside her. On the ride back, Kayla watched Rook through the armored glass. He wasn't lying down like usual. He sat upright, watching the road. Not the road behind, but ahead. As if he knew something was coming. For the first time in years, Kayla didn't sleep on the way back to base. Her hands felt colder than normal, and her palms still trembled. Rook stayed quiet, but Kayla understood. This wasn't just another mission. It might be the last time they stood together in the light. At 3 a.m., the armored truck rolled through the base gate. The sky above El Paso hung heavy with gray, but the rain never came. Lamplight stretched across the damp pavement, reflecting the distorted shadows of 2 survivors, 1 woman, 1 dog. Kyla stepped out first. Rook followed, no leash needed. His ears drooped slightly, but his eyes scanned every wall, every door. He wasn't walking like a soldier off duty. He was still watching, still listening. They passed through the training yard. Steel frames glistened with dew, old boots and dusty chairs scattered like ghosts of rookies passed. Rook walked slower than usual, head high, and for a second, Kayla thought he was listening to something only he could hear. Inside the main building, Kayla's eyes caught a photo on the hallway wall. Federal Tactical Unit, 2021. She stood in the middle, hand resting on Rook's back. They were both smiling. Really smiling. How long had it been since she'd seen that face in the mirror? A plain envelope waited on her desk. No stamp, no sender. Just 1 line. Requested to report. She opened it. Her eyes stopped on the final words. Internal meeting. Tomorrow night. Classification. Top secret. Nothing on the page screamed danger. But the moment she touched it, a coldness slid down her spine. Like someone had been there before her. Like this wasn't the first time her desk had been touched. That night, she didn't change out of her uniform. Didn't unclip her belt. Kayla sat still in the glow of her night lamp. Her face, lined with smoke and sun, caught in soft amber light. Rook lay at the foot of the bed, chin on his paws. But his eyes didn't close. His pupils widened in the dark, not toward the door, but toward the space behind the thin curtain. At 3:30, Kayla drifted off for 10 minutes. When she woke, Rook hadn't moved. But this time, his neck turned. His ears stood up. And then for the first time since 100 missions ago, Rook barked. Just once. Low. Quiet. But it cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Kayla sat bolt upright. She didn't hear anything. She didn't ask. Because if Rook had spoken. Something was already in motion. The sun rose slowly that day. Not gold, not warm, but a pale silver, like tarnished steel drawn across the sky. When Kayla stepped into the mess hall, she felt it. The shift. Not admiration after a mission, not envy, but something else. Quiet, sharp, watching. Like she wasn't a soldier anymore, but a subject, under surveillance. A young sergeant saluted, but didn't meet her gaze. A technician, one who used to sneak treats to Rook, turned away without a word. And halfway through the corridor, Rook stopped. Not because of a sound, not because of a threat, but something in the air, something Kayla couldn't sense, yet Rook could. The fur along his spine lifted, his stance tightened. Kayla had to call his name twice before he moved again. That's when she knew. That old instinct, the one buried deep in the bones of every seasoned fighter, rose to the surface. When a loyal dog changes his rhythm, the world around him already has. And on certain days, like that one, silence becomes the loudest kind of warning. By afternoon, the sky wore a pale yellow sheen. Sunlight pushed faintly through frosted glass, tinting the admin hall in faded dust. The walls felt close, listening. A call came in, no details, no voice raised. Just a flat message. Major Monroe, report to room 7C. Urgent. The officer on the line spoke evenly, but at the very end there was a breath, a pause, almost like he wanted to say more. And couldn't. Kayla reached for her coat. Rook stood before she even called. No leash, no hesitation. Just instinct. 11 years. Always at her side. Hallway 4 led to the restricted intelligence wing. Soundproof glass. Surveillance cameras that never blinked. The door to room 7C stood slightly ajar. Unusual. Inside, no commanding officers, no insignias, no welcome. Just one man. Tall, lean, pale-faced in a wrinkled black suit. His eyes were sunken, like he hadn't slept in nights. He didn't extend a hand, didn't offer a title. Just said, "I'm a liaison from Homeland Security." Kayla didn't answer. She didn't have to. Behind her, Rook stiffened. His breath deepened. His muscles braced. Quiet, coiled, alert. The man flipped a folder open. I pulled 2 photos. Low res, surveillance quality, washed in green static. One image showed Kayla in conversation with a man on a southern street corner. His face shadowed. A vehicle's brake light glared behind him, but just enough light caught a tattoo on his arm. The man's voice came again, this time harder. "When did you speak to him?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Kayla remembered. 6 months ago, she'd visited a former K9 handler, a double amputee, Operation X Ridge. That man wasn't the focus, just his nephew, the one who answered the door. But in blurry photos, truth weighs less than narrative. Before she could explain, the man cut in. Sharper now. "We believe you may have knowingly or unknowingly leaked internal troop movements to a domestic extremist cell. You are hereby suspended from active duty, effective immediately." No time for shock, no space for protest. 2 plainclothes officers entered the room, one wearing gloves, the other holding a recording device. Rook growled, low, controlled, but unmistakable. Kayla raised her hand. One motion, that was enough to calm him. But Rook's eyes never left the man in the suit. Then came the blow that cut deeper than all the rest. The dog will be reassigned to Northlake for temporary evaluation. Kayla turned. Slowly. That phrase, reassigned for evaluation, wasn't a procedure. It was a blade slicing the thread that bound them together. Years of war, years of trust, years of Rook stepping into fire, standing between her and death. Now swept aside by one cold phrase. Temporary reassignment. No one asked Rook. No one asked if a 4-legged warrior wanted to leave his partner. As they escorted her out, Kayla turned her head. Just once. And she saw Rook resisting the leash. He barked. Short, sharp, loud. A bark that ricocheted off the sterile corridor walls, not asking for help, not begging, just saying what had to be said. "I'm still here." Then the doors closed. And that was the last time Rook saw her. No farewell, no folded flag, no taps. Just a gray afternoon where a soldier was stripped of honor, and a dog was led away like he'd never had a name. Rook's footsteps grew heavier with every hallway, as if every step was a goodbye. And when the gate clanged shut behind him, that was the end of a chapter neither of them wanted to write. Inside those soundproofed walls, under a ceiling of harsh white lights, Koila sat alone. Room 47B, they called it, a name that felt more like a label on a storage crate than a place meant for people. There were no cuffs on the table, but they weren't needed. The moment the door shut behind her, she knew everything familiar was already gone. The empty chair across from her stayed that way for 12 minutes. And in those 12 minutes, Kayla could hear every beat of her heart. Not because she was afraid, but because whatever was coming wasn't an accusation. It was a decision. When the door opened, 4 people walked in. 1 officer from JAG, 1 from internal security, 1 from strategic media, and the last, someone she used to believe had her back, Deputy Commander Mason Griggs. No one greeted her. No one extended a hand. Everything unfolded like a play they'd rehearsed too many times. So well, in fact, that they'd stripped out all the human parts. The media rep turned on a tablet. A screen behind them lit up. A video began playing, grainy footage like it was pulled from an old surveillance camera. There was Kyla standing beside a military truck in the technical depot, her voice distorted but audible. Coordinates, western side, movement, concealment. The footage jumped. A different angle now, this time from a hallway. Kyla holding a phone, her face tense, arguing with someone. One word kept repeating in the audio. Data transfer. She didn't move. The internal agent leaned forward, his voice low, stripped of emotion. We've received reports indicating you exchanged sensitive troop movement data related to New Laredo. That aligns with the timeline of a supply convoy ambush. No one asked if she wanted to speak. No one confirmed her identity. And even when Kyla began to open her mouth, Mason spoke over her. Cold. Measured. I filed the report. The room fell silent, like someone had dropped a blade onto concrete. Kayla turned to look at him. Mason Griggs, the man who once nodded to her in sandstorms and night raids. The man who used to whisper, "You lead this one, I'll cover," because someone else had kids waiting at home. He wouldn't meet her eyes. His stare hovered somewhere above the table, like someone had told him, "Don't look at Kayla Monroe. Don't remember. Don't remember the times Rook took the hit. Don't remember when Kayla volunteered for missions no one else wanted." He went on, "You accessed an unregistered data drive. Security cameras show you exiting the tech room at 2:17 hours. The log said equipment check, but everything was already sealed that night." His voice wasn't cruel. It was clinical, like a judge stamping a sentence he didn't write. Kyla pressed her lips together. No tears. No outburst. Just the stillness of someone watching a betrayal dress itself up as protocol. 10 minutes later, the meeting was over. No verdict, no transcript. But she understood. The danger wasn't in the footage. It was in the way no one in the room wanted to believe anything else. As she stepped into the corridor, the scent hit her. Old tile, fresh paint, pressed uniforms. But for the first time in 12 years, Kayla felt like this place no longer recognized her. People looked away as she passed. Not out of shame, not out of guilt, just avoidance. No one asked about Rook. No one asked if she was okay. Just the whistle of wind slipping through the hallway vents, echoing like time falling out of her hands. And at the far end, A round mirror on the wall caught her reflection. A soldier, once trusted, now walking toward a place with no name, a closed meeting, a blurry video, an old ally turned accuser, and a door that no longer led back. That night the lights went out earlier than usual across the base. The hallway dimmed, like someone wanted the truth to disappear before anyone had the chance to remember it. Kyla packed what little she could: a toothbrush, a folded shirt, a photo, face down. Then a knock. Not 3 short taps like protocol, just one. Then the door opened. 2 men entered, one in uniform, name tag removed, the other in a black dress shirt, no insignia. No greetings, no explanations. They handed her a document, detention order. No charges, no signature from a superior, just one line in bold. Federal investigation, classified level. Kyla stared at the paper like it was a tired joke. But the man in black wasn't laughing. His face wasn't mocking, it was empty, like this had been done before. Too many times. Then a sound. Heavy. Familiar. Like wind slamming into brick. The door behind her creaked open. Rook stepped inside. No one had called him. No one had opened the latch, but somehow Rook knew. He stopped in the center of the room. Ears up. Eyes locked on the 2 men. Then a voice from a radio clipped to the soldier's belt. "The dog needs to be separated." Kayla turned. Separated? Her voice cracked. "Rook's a soldier. A Kalinstic, Not anymore," the man cut in. "According to the new order, Rook is being transferred to Northlake for behavioral review." "You're speaking like he's under suspicion." "That's not our call," the man said flatly. "The order came from above." Kayla dropped to her knees. She reached for Rook's head, her hand trembling slightly, but steady. Rook stepped in, rested his head against her chest, then looked up. No sound. But in those eyes, Kayla could see it. Rook was memorizing her face, every line, every shadow, the face of the woman who had stood beside him through it all. She didn't plead, didn't cry. But when the men moved to take Rook, something in her broke free. It wasn't logic. It was instinct. "Don't take Rook from me." No one answered. The door opened. Rook turned once, locking eyes with her. And then Kayla screamed, not in fear, but because she knew. When a dog is taken without a reassignment form, it means they're not coming back. "Rook!" Her voice tore through the empty corridor like shrapnel. But Rook was already pulled beyond the cold white wall. Plastic zip ties coiled tight around her wrists. No clicking sound. No metal. She was escorted out of the building, across dew-soaked grass. Ahead, a waiting vehicle. No license plates, no visible driver. They pushed her into the back seat. The door slammed shut behind her, a sound that felt like goodbye. From the base to Hemlock Federal Detention, no one said a word. Kayla stared through the narrow gap in the window, watching the city sleep. Buildings lit, cars rolling, life moving on like a silent film, with the soundtrack cut out. Inside her mind, there was only one image left. Rook's eyes, locked on hers, right before he vanished behind the steel door. It wasn't a goodbye, and it wasn't a plea. It was the gaze of a warrior saying, "I won't forget." And when the transport stopped in front of Hemlock's main gate, Kayla understood. The greatest fear wasn't imprisonment. It was being erased. In a world where truth only mattered if someone felt like remembering it. The gate creaked open. No greeting, no explanation, no paperwork. just the slow, dragging sound of metal mesh sliding over rails. And Kyla walked in. Not as a convicted criminal, but as a memory someone wanted to be buried. Hemlock was where names once praised got scrubbed clean, where achievements disappeared from the record, a place no one asked about, a place that didn't exist on maps. Because in Hemlock, the government owed no one an explanation, and pain needed no justification. They placed her in cell 14. A concrete box, no windows, no clock, no calendar, just one bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a white light so harsh it felt like frost. Her rank was stripped. Her uniform was replaced with an inmate suit, 711K. No one used her name anymore, only numbers. And for the first 3 days, Kayla said nothing. No answers, no protests, because she already knew from the moment they took Rook, this wasn't about justice. It never had been. At night, Hemlock went dead silent. No voices, just the steady drip from a rusted air pipe above. A rhythm, slow, relentless, like an invisible clock counting down the life of someone forgotten. Kayla didn't sleep. She lay on a thin pad over cold iron slats, eyes fixed on the ceiling, blank, shapeless. And in those still moments, she whispered in a voice barely her own, "Rook, don't forget me." 3 words, soft as breath, but each time she said them, her chest clenched, as if her memories were fighting off the rot that tried to take root in her mind. By the 10th day, Kyla began counting the guards' footsteps. Shifts rotated every 4 hours. Some walked heavy, some floated like mist. She didn't memorize them out of curiosity. She did it because without time, the line between day and night blurred. No letters, no visitors, no messages. She once imagined she'd be furious, that she'd scream, revolt. But anger never came, just an emptiness, cold, deep, terrifyingly quiet. Kayla began rewriting the story inside her head, through memory, through sensation, through the soft breaths Rook made during nighttime camps, through the sound of his paws echoing down empty halls, through that glance when Rook knew someone was behind them before anyone else did. No one asked about those moments, but she remembered. Rook had never left her behind on a mission. Not once. And he wouldn't this time either. She believed if truth had a form, it would come on 4 legs, with eyes that didn't lie, moving through walls and wire just to reach her again. And because of that belief, Kayla lived. Not to win, not to escape, but to wait for her name to be spoken again, not by a judge, but by the sound of familiar footsteps tapping against a frozen floor. Somewhere far north, where rows of pine trees stood guard along the gravel road into the North Lake Training Center, Rook sat quietly in the corner of Kennel 19. Eyes open, but not blinking. Tail still. Ears up, but not reacting. A living statue caught in the last light of day. Present, but not belonging. They noted in the report, transferred from a federal unit, no retraining needed, non-responsive to basic commands, displays behavioral instability. And beneath that, in red ink, possible trauma linked to handler separation, reassessment required. But no one at Northlake really cared why Rook had changed. This place wasn't built for questions. It was built to sort. The strong were filtered into new task forces. The slow, the too aggressive, or the uncooperative were labeled, categorized, shifted into the removed from cycle group, and quietly erased from the system. No one asked where they went. Rook didn't attack. But he didn't let anyone near. Whenever someone stepped up to the kennel gate, Rook simply watched. No growl, no bark. But that stare, it made even seasoned handlers step back. There was something in his eyes. Not fear, not hope, just a hollow space where a warrior had once stood, like Rook had seen the end of what a K9 could endure, and returned with only survival in his bones. One new staffer once tried to approach with a squeaky toy. She knelt, held it out, voice bright and gentle like a training manual. "Come on, buddy, wanna play?" Rook didn't move. Only after she stepped back 2 paces did he finally turn his head slowly, like forgiveness being offered, but not given. They started calling him something at the center. The silent ghost. He didn't eat with the others, didn't go out on schedule, didn't obey a single directive. But he never lashed out either. Rook just waited. Each night, after drills ended and the center fell into silence, a few night shift workers would see him rise, step softly to the front of the kennel, and stare into the distance. Toward nothing. Just fencing. Dark forest. And a sky scattered with pale, flickering stars. One night, when the wind howled harder than usual, Rook let out a long, low howl. It wasn't wild. It wasn't mournful. It sounded like a breath that had been buried too long finally breaking free. The whole kennel row fell still. Dogs that had been gnawing on bars or curled in sleep stopped, lifting their heads. But none howled back. Just one voice. Alone. Fading into the cold. The next morning's log added a line. Recommend no pairing with other dogs at this time. Possible signs of dissociative disconnect. But no one knew, or maybe no one wanted to know, that Rook wasn't looking for connection with his kind. What Rook waited for wasn't in the orders, wasn't on any list, wasn't even considered real anymore. Rook was waiting for a breath he knew, a hand on his head, a voice in the dark whispering, "Good boy, Rook." Each day in North Lake etched a little more light from Rook's eyes, but deep beneath the stillness, some ember still glowed, like a coal buried under ash. No one dared get close, no one gave commands, no one asked any more. Only Rook, in the shadows of Kennel 19, kept facing that direction toward a place with no name. A place where maybe, just maybe a call was still waiting. And then, one windy morning, Old Man Murphy showed up. He wasn't on the payroll anymore. Murphy used to be the lead trainer at North Lake, a legend among K9 handlers, 30 years in the service, hundreds of dogs trained. He'd had a mild stroke, retired quietly, moved to a wooden cabin 10 miles out by the edge of the forest. But sometimes, for the tough ones, the ones no one else could reach, Murphy came back. And Rook was the toughest case yet. When the staff read him the reports, Murphy just lit a cigarette, settled onto the wooden bench across from the kennels, and stared at Rook for 15 straight minutes. Nobody spoke. They waited for the verdict. Murphy said nothing. Just sat there. His eyes, lined with age, calm as frozen lake water, mirrored exactly what he saw in Rook's. At last, he exhaled softly, almost too soft to hear. "This one's not broken." No one argued, but a younger trainer offered hesitantly, "He's unresponsive, sir. Won't obey. No contact." Murphy turned to him. Not harsh, but firm. "He's not unresponsive. He's waiting." That afternoon, Murphy filed a request to take Rook home. Not under any standard adoption policy, but under a rarely used classification, individual recovery sponsorship. A special provision meant for battle-worn K9S who couldn't be fully decommissioned. Most of those forms ended up forgotten. Half-finished, discarded, but not this one. On day 17, Rook left Northlake. It was drizzling. No one lined up. No one recorded the handoff. But as the last gate opened, Rook stopped. Turned once. I looked back at Kennel 19. Just a glance. Barely a second. But Murphy saw it. He smiled, barely. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know you remember." Murphy's cabin sat quietly beneath the shadow of old pine trees, with a long porch that looked out over a still lake. He didn't chain Rook, didn't cage him, didn't give commands. Every morning, Murphy just opened the door, poured a black coffee, and settled into his worn rocking chair, like a man waiting for winter to pass. For the first 3 days, Rook didn't eat. He only drank water, sat by the porch, ears alert, eyes searching beyond the trees, as if trying to track something he'd lost along the way. Murphy didn't force it. He simply left the food near the steps, unlatched the kennel door, and swept the porch in silence. On the 4th day, Rook ate half. On the 5th, he walked to the lake on his own and sat beside Murphy's chair, and on the 6th, Rook lay down for the first time, resting his head on Murphy's old combat boots, the same pair, beaten and patched, with the heel stitched by hand. Murphy didn't pet him, didn't say a word. He just pulled a light blanket over Rook's back as the wind turned colder. That night, for the first time in nearly a month, Rook slept. The next morning, Murphy tried a soft command. Rook lifted his head, but didn't move. Murphy chuckled. "That's all right. I don't like taking orders anymore either." And so they fell into a rhythm without a name. No commands, no drills, no leash. But each morning, like clockwork, when Murphy's cough echoed through the cabin and the door creaked open, Rook was already there, waiting, not barking, not rushing in, just sitting. Silent, grounded, steady like the fading shadow of a soul who once learned that waiting is part of survival. No one trained Rook anymore. But Rook hadn't forgotten how to move beside someone, how to follow the pace of boots he trusted. And some nights, when the radio clicked on and the evening news played, if a voice even vaguely resembled Kyla's, Rook would tilt his head slightly. Not move. Just breathe. A little slower. Murphy didn't speak. Just reached down, gently brushed a finger across Rook's ear. His eyes didn't lift to the screen. They stayed on the floor, right where Rook lay. "Your time'll come. She'll find you again." And Rook, as if he understood, closed his eyes. Not because he was content, but because somewhere out there, someone still believed that waiting was never in vain. A week later, a letter arrived from Northlake. An invitation. They were holding a live field demonstration, a public showcase for visiting dignitaries, where elite units would display obedience drills, tactical maneuvers, and all the shiny results of their training programs. Murphy hated those shows. He hated the lights, the fake whistles, the heavy scent of cologne clinging to crisp suits. But this time, he said yes. Maybe he was tired of watching Rook wander the edge of the wooden yard, staring into the trees waiting for something no one could name. That morning, Murphy didn't wear a uniform. He put on a faded gray shirt, his old khakis, and those same field boots, still stitched at the heel. Rook walked beside him. No leash, no command, no name call. Just side-by-side steps, 2 old warriors breathing the same rhythm. By the time they arrived, the grounds were set. Fencing, tents for guests, cameras rolling. Murphy didn't put Rook in line. He stood behind the trucks, out of view. Rook sat at his feet. Calm. Unbothered by the barking orders, the stomping boots, the PA announcements. But then, A black SUV pulled into the center of the field. The door opened. Senator Vaughn stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, that polished strut of a man who knew every spotlight would find him eventually. His eyes were cold, arrogant, as if he wasn't just arriving to an exercise, but stepping onto a stage meant for him alone. Murphy didn't look up. He unscrewed the lid of his thermos, poured a bit of coffee. Only Rook raised his head. And in that quiet second, when no one else noticed, Rook stood. Front paws firm, neck extended, eyes locked onto the man exiting the SUV. No growl, no bark, no leap, just a gaze. Steady, sharp, unblinking, like something ancient and buried had just split open in his memory. Murphy felt it, the cold climb up his spine. He leaned down, placed a hand on Rook's shoulder. Rook didn't move, didn't blink, still watching. And Murphy, a man who had watched dogs rush through gunfire, who had held the torn bodies of heroes wrapped in fur, understood one thing in that moment. Rook wasn't remembering. He was recognizing, not a smell, not a sound, but a truth rooted so deep in instinct that no human could name it, and no dog could ever forget. Vaughn kept walking. He never saw Rook, never noticed that just behind him a pair of eyes followed, not with hate, but with a question that had never been answered. That night, Murphy said nothing. He just sat on the porch, coffee trembling in his hands, a thin crack trailing the rim of his favorite mug. Rook rested his head on Murphy's leg, eyes open. Murphy didn't ask. He didn't need to, because in that look, that stare that didn't waver, something had been awakened, not instinct, evidence. And if the world had any sense left, if it still knew how to listen, then maybe, just maybe a dog had just started telling the one story no one else could. That morning, the Texas sky wore a quiet shade of gray, like the fog had crept in overnight, not to soften the day, but to veil something that was drawing near. At the North Lake K-9 training facility, they were holding their annual ceremony. A solemn tribute to the four-legged soldiers who had fallen in the line of duty. A long banner lined the entrance, printed with the insignias of K-9 units from across the country. Wooden stands held black and white portraits, each marked with a name, a date of sacrifice, and a simple inscription. Service, loyalty, never forgotten. Guests arrived early. National news networks had set up signal towers. Military correspondents clipped mics to their collars. Rows of white-covered chairs awaited in the center court, each seat marked with a single rose reserved for the families of fallen K-9 heroes. And right on schedule, at 10 a.m., sharp and armored SUV rolled through the gates, flanked by 2 escort vehicles. The air grew colder as the car door opened. Senator Vaughn stepped out, just as expected. Black suit, gray tie, shoes polished to mirror finish. His stride was too steady, too deliberate, like he believed he was the embodiment of honor itself. Applause followed him. Cameras tracked his every step. And then Vaughn took the microphone, bowing his head briefly before speaking. "We gather here today," he began, "to remember the silent warriors, those four-legged souls who served without glory, fought without praise, and fell without ceremony. The K-9 unit is an irreplaceable symbol of loyalty." His words rang clear. His face wore the solemn dignity of grief. Anyone watching the broadcast would believe him. Everyone seated below likely did, because his words were perfect. His voice didn't shake. His gaze never flinched. But far away, behind the ceremony grounds, past 3 long rows of kennels tucked in the shadows, a creature watched. Rook. No muzzle, no chain, But no freedom either. Rook sat motionless inside the run, a dark silhouette stretched long across cracked concrete. The slanting winter sun cast a thin line of light through the bars, falling right across Rook's forehead like an invisible cross. Murphy stood at the far end of the corridor. Arms folded, eyes locked on Rook. Rook didn't bark, didn't growl, but his gaze never left Vaughn. Even with dozens of meters and a sea of people in between, Rook stared as if nothing else existed. And had someone stepped into the shadows of the back walkways, they might have seen Rook wasn't looking like a dog recognizing an old master. He was watching like a soldier who's just spotted the man who dragged away the one person he was sworn to protect. The speech continued. The same poetic words, the same practiced tone. A voice like a flag salute carved in stone. But in Rook's eyes, the entire world had shrunk to a single shape. One pair of footsteps, one scent from long ago, leather polish, cheap hairspray mixed with fading mint, the scent Kayla always noticed when Vaughn passed the command corridor. Murphy knew. Rook hadn't forgotten. Not out of hatred, but because dogs don't edit memory. They don't revise. They don't lie. A bell rang across the ceremony field, signaling the moment of silence. The whole base froze, flags lowered to half-mast, hands pressed to hearts, cameras dipped their heads. And in that breathless pause when every gaze turned downward, when the noise of the world vanished, Rook stood. No sound, no rattle of chains, just one simple motion. He stood, placed both front paws gently against the kennel gate, head tilted slightly, eyes locked on the figure speaking beneath the flags. Murphy's fists tightened. No one else knew what was about to happen. But he did. Because what was coming wasn't part of the ceremony anymore. It was truth, trying to speak for itself. And then, it came. No warning. No signal. A thunderclap tore through the silence of the ceremony like someone had slashed the sky with a blade of sound. Gunshots. Not one, 3, spaced, clear, deliberate. The sound of shattering glass, screams from the guests, the scuffle of feet, chairs crashing over, and the shrieking alarm twisting the air tight like a steel cable snapping under strain. The first to move were the black-suited security teams. They surged forward, swarming the podium. Senator Vaughn was pulled back abruptly, stumbling, nearly falling, forced behind the armored SUV. K-9 units were released instantly, charging to perimeter points like trained instincts in motion. But while the chaos converged toward the main gate, where the suspected shooter might be in a quiet corner under the shade of the old kennel wing, a different kind of movement stirred. Rook had already been standing. A sharp creak rang out as Rook struck the gate with one powerful paw. Once. Twice. The third hit burst the rusted hinge clean off. No commands, no keys. Rook broke out. Alone. And the moment light flooded the corridor, Rook shot forward, toward the heart of the ceremony. No hesitation, no glances, no waiting. Murphy gave chase. Too late. His shout was swallowed by the chaos of sirens and stampeding boots. Rook charged, a gray blur slicing through the frenzy past terrified onlookers, past the flags lining the aisles, past riot shields rising too slowly to matter. No one could stop him. No one dared. One young officer tried to step in but froze the instant Rook locked eyes with him. No growl, no threat, just a stare that said, clear as thunder, you don't understand. But I remember. Rook veered away from the exit, didn't chase the shots, didn't run to the perimeter. He headed straight for the center of the field, where Vaughn had been dragged moments earlier, now crouched behind a wall of protection. One leap, No run-up. No bark. Silence fell over the grounds. Only the wind, and the sound of Rook's paws hitting the dirt. That steel-gray body came to a halt right in front of Vaughn. No lunge, no sound. Just standing still, head low, eyes fixed on the tailored jacket now smeared with dust. A security agent reached for his weapon. Murphy appeared just in time. His voice didn't shout, but it was enough. "Don't." Vaughn hadn't recovered. His eyes were wide, breath ragged, hands trembling against his chest. But Rook had caught it. A scent. Not of blood. Not of gunpowder. Something older. Something Kayla had once stopped for in the middle of a battlefield. The scent of a hidden camera. Rook stepped forward, lowered his head, nose to the left pocket of Vaughn's jacket. A sharp tear as Rook bit through the fabric. A small device no larger than a pen fell to the ground, its lens glinting like a needle under the sun. The clink it made was soft, like water dripping onto stone. But it was loud enough to ignite something no one could yet name. Rook looked up. And barked. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a threat. It was a signal, a warning, a reckoning. And every camera, whether broadcasting live or filming quietly in the background, caught the moment. The moment a discarded dog written off, locked away, forgotten, stepped into the spotlight of a carefully orchestrated ceremony. Not to play along, but to blow it wide open. In that suspended breath of the world, Rook didn't charge Vaughn like a wild animal. Rook didn't bite, didn't growl, didn't threaten. Rook did something no one expected. A sudden, precise movement, jaws locking onto the edge of Vaughn's pristine jacket, the same jacket that shimmered proudly under the morning sun just minutes before. A sickening rip tore the silence in two. Fabric shredded, the coat yanked away, revealing not just a man in panic, but a strange lining beneath, a double-stitched inner pocket reinforced against the chest, clearly meant to conceal, something not meant to be seen. Something fell. Small, but heavy enough for the sound of metal hitting stone to crack the air like a hammer. Everyone looked down. There, in the center of the ceremony grounds, a black, cylindrical object, no bigger than a finger, blinking a single red light. A hidden camera. Murphy stepped forward, bent down, picked it up with steady hands. He turned it once, and with a few practiced taps, the embedded micro-lens flared to life. Footage appeared. No sound, but the image was piercingly clear. A room, familiar. A military map lit dimly from above, and a woman in olive fatigues standing beneath it, her eyes sharp, her finger pointing toward the western quadrant of El Paso. Kayla. Murphy said nothing. He didn't need to, because every soul standing there had seen this clip before, the same grainy, edited version that had been played in hearings, twisted into evidence, used to label Kayla a traitor. But this was different. A wider frame, no audio cuts, no blacked-out segments, and most importantly, no indication of Kayla ever leaking information. Instead, she was issuing a tactical report, clearly warning about civilian vulnerabilities, and finishing with, "I do not share coordinates without confirmation from command." Then, from off-screen, a voice replied, "I am command today." That voice was Vaughn's. The silence that followed was longer than a lifetime. A young reporter in the front row stepped backward, hand trembling as she lowered her headset. They had just confirmed. This footage had never been released. Not in any official archive. Not on any military database. And yet Rook had remembered. The scent of Vaughn's nicotine-stained fingers from that day. The faint residue of fabric spray hastily applied after the briefing. The smell of deception. Something only a dog who's known truth could ever recognize as false. Vaughn staggered. His hand swept across his chest as if to hide what had already fallen. But it was too late. The broadcast was still live, and Rook, after one final bark that echoed into the stillness, stepped back. Not to flee, but to clear the frame. A German shepherd, eyes bright, posture steady, standing among flags, folding chairs, and a crowd frozen in disbelief, as if saying, "Do you believe me now?" Murphy knelt beside Rook. "It's all right now, old friend." His voice shook but held, his hand resting gently on Rook's shoulder. And Rook didn't bark again, didn't lunge. He simply sat down, calm, composed, like a soldier who had finally completed the mission. From the day they tore him from Kayla to this moment, he had carried the truth, and now he has delivered it. No more words were needed. Because this time, silence was the loudest proof of all. Within seconds, the live stream from the memorial site exploded across the internet, spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. On screen, even as the camera trembled with a slow, stunned zoom, viewers could see it clearly. The tension on Vaughn's face, the fear in his eyes, as the hidden device slipped from the custom-tailored jacket he'd worn for this polished, official event. And then a hashtag appeared in the comment feed. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Justice for Kayla. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't engineered by a social media strategist. It was raw instinct, from people who for the first time saw something that didn't need to be explained, didn't need narration, didn't need words. Only the eyes of a dog. On Twitter, a 12-second clip, Rook tearing the coat, the hidden camera hitting the floor, the lone bark echoing across the courtyard, was set to slow motion and cinematic music. But underneath, the captions told a different story. "You can't train a dog to do that for fame." "I don't know much about the military, but I trust Rook." That wasn't instinct. That was a memory. Major networks moved fast. CNN, Reuters, AP, they all reposted the footage from every possible angle. Alongside them came resurfaced files of Kayla Monroe, once a decorated officer, once a field leader in life-or-death missions, then gone, erased. All after one night, branded a traitor. That evening, Ayanna Delgado, former Pentagon war correspondent, was the first to speak up live on national broadcast. "I've seen the original report. It didn't match what we were shown in court. And if a retired K-9 can still recognize the scent of the truth, then maybe it's time we ask, how many of us smelled the lies and said nothing?" Her words were clipped and shared over a black and white still of Rook, sitting under the fading sun, head tilted slightly, as if waiting, as if asking a question that no human had yet found the courage to say aloud. By nightfall, a new hashtag emerged. "Bring her home." There was no movement, no leader, no campaign team, just people once they saw the truth wanting to make things right. Veterans formed open forums. They reposted every deleted file from Kayla's case. Law students hosted teach-ins on federal trial rights. One high school in Arizona even launched a special course, "What a Dog Can Teach Us About Loyalty." Murphy said nothing. He gave no interviews. He simply removed Rook's nameplate from the North Lake Kennel Gate and replaced it with an old tag, one Kayla had clipped to his collar during their first training mission in El Paso. 3 faded words, handwritten, "Trusted. Still." And as outrage, grief, and awakening rippled across the country, a quiet update slipped beneath the radar. Kayla Monroe, once sentenced to indefinite solitary confinement in Hemlock, filed a 3rd appeal. But this time, she didn't use a lawyer. She didn't write a defense. She submitted a single URL, the video of Rook tearing Vaughn's coat time-stamped at second 11. No words, no argument. Just a moment seen through the eyes of a dog. And buried in the flood of comments and broadcasts, one private message landed in Ayanna Delgado's encrypted inbox. The first journalist to say Kayla's name on air, after 7 years of silence. The message held only one line. I was the one forced to edit that footage. I still have the backup drive, but I don't think I'm safe anymore. No sender info, no profile picture, new account, no signature. Ayanna read it, twice, 3 times, then replied with 3 words. Where, when, meet. 4 hours later, in a quiet coffee shop tucked in Old East Dallas, she sat across from a man in his 40s, heavy canvas jacket, hat pulled low. At his feet, a weathered tote bag he never let out of arm's reach. When he looked up, she knew those were the eyes of a man who had seen the truth, and stayed silent for too long. I'm Edwin Harrow, he said softly. Former senior tech, tactical data security unit. I know you can't verify that right away, but I brought this. He reached into the bag, pulled out a silver external drive, paint peeling at the edges. This is the cached file, from before they made me wipe the original. They forced me to splice fake audio, cut footage, erase the trace log from Kayla's locator tag. I never thought anyone would believe me. But then... His eyes drifted to her phone screen, paused on the frame of Rook barking, the lens of the spy cam glinting under the Texas sun. I saw that bark, and I knew I can't hide anymore. Ayanna didn't ask a thing. She didn't need to. Her fingers gently brushed the drive. Because evidence can be deleted. But memory and guilt will never go quietly. When the first article broke with the headline, "Former technician breaks silence, old hard drive may clear Kayla Monroe's name," it didn't just make waves. It lit the fuse of a movement that had no precedent, not in courtrooms, not from the military, but from those who had stayed silent for far too long. A group of tech students launched a website to analyze the raw data chain from the drive. Independent programmers ran encryption checks on the manipulated footage, frame by frame. And former K9 handlers began to reconnect, sharing stories of Rook's strange behavior over the past few years, as if that dog had always known the truth, and was simply waiting for someone to speak it aloud. On Reddit, a user named EchoHound posted, "If Rook is the only witness left, then we're living in a world where a dog understands betrayal better than humans ever did." That quote was printed and pinned to the gate of Mirror Haven, the K9 training camp where Murphy had first brought Rook when no one else wanted him. That evening, Edwin slipped out the back door of the cafe. He didn't look back. Didn't leave a number. Just left behind one thing. The same thing Kayla had once protected with everything she had. A fragment of truth. So small, the world had forgotten it existed. But thanks to Rook, it had returned. And this time, no one could look away. 3 days after the article went live, the names of 2 federal agents tied directly to Kayla's case began appearing in internal forums, darknet threads, and private groups, where veterans spoke truths that hadn't yet reached the light. One was Harrington, a former technical assistant from the Federal Rapid Response Team. He vanished from his residence the night before a subpoena was officially issued. The other, Vaughn C. Wright, the very same man who had once stood beside Kayla as her deputy commander, was caught preparing to flee the country under a false identity. At Houston International Airport, Wright entered the VIP lounge through a private passage. He didn't look at anyone, didn't turn around. One hand stayed buried in his jacket pocket, as if clinging to something no one could take away. But the door didn't open. A cold voice rang out. Mr. Wright, the extradition order is now in effect. Please come with us. Two Interpol officers, working with the Federal Security Task Force, stepped forward. In their hands, an official warrant, sealed and stamped, along with photographic evidence cross-referenced with the video recovered from Edwin Harrow's hard drive. Wright didn't flinch. He simply smirked. All this because of a dog? No one answered him, because by now the truth didn't belong to anyone. It stood on its own. And this time it stood on 4 legs. Back at Northlake, Murphy sat by the fence, his hand resting softly on Rook's head. National TV was replaying the arrest footage. Rook didn't look away from the screen. Ears up. Silent. Still. Murphy gave a slow nod. They believe you now, old friend. He stood, moved to the wooden cabinet beside the kennel, and pulled out a worn file folder, its corners yellowed with age. Stamped on the front, Canine Behavioral Review. Murphy flipped to Rook's page. Under the sent response section, a note in faded blue ink, written in his own slanted handwriting. September 2020. Strong reactive behavior when exposed to scent from Senator Vaughn's jacket. No command, no training. Instinctive response. He hadn't filed that note in the official report. No one would have believed it. Everyone thought Rook was no longer fit for duty. But now, as data poured into daylight, as phones rang off the hook, as crowds began forming outside the White House with handmade signs, and justice for Kayla painted in bold strokes, Murphy knew. The part that moved him most wasn't justice. It was Rook's eyes. Eyes that had never changed. Not since the day Kayla was taken away. They'd always stayed the same, steady, silent, waiting. In a world terrified of truth. Rook was never afraid. Rook's only fear was that no one would ever open the door to let the truth in. But now the door had opened. The legal office of the Justice Interpretation Initiative in D.C. received over 1,000 emails in just 3 hours. Every subject line was the same. Reopen Kayla's case. But they weren't from family, not from lawyers, not even from activist groups. They were from people who had never met her doctors, firefighters, law students, veterans, and those who had once served alongside dogs like Rook. A 3-minute clip, captured at the Northlake Memorial, had become an unofficial legal exhibit. In it, Rook, once declared unfit for service, didn't attack, didn't act on impulse. Rook simply stood up, locked eyes with one man, and silently tore open a suit jacket. Inside was a recording device. Its serial number matched perfectly to a redacted report from years ago. On June 17th, a federal court released an official statement. All original files in Kayla Monroe's case would be temporarily recalled. Unverified evidence sealed. All previous rulings suspended pending independent investigation. On national television, a spokesperson for the Veterans Alliance announced, "Justice once slept inside a falsified report, but today a dog woke it up. What was meant as symbolic became literal." The quote was plastered across magazine covers for a week. And in a small office in South Texas, at a foundation for former federal operatives, a middle-aged man folded the article with care, setting down his coffee cup with a quiet tap. He opened a drawer, pulled out an old folder, its corners stained and edges curled. A faded sticky note still clung to the side. "Kayla, I'm sorry." He placed the folder inside an envelope, sealed it shut, and signed in red ink. "To Federal Court. Reopen Monroe file." At Hemlock, Kayla had no idea. She was still counting guard steps through the night, still scribbling daily notes on addressless paper, still holding on to half of a photo. The other half showed Rook. But something changed that day. A guard called her name. Not her prisoner number. Her full name. Kayla Monroe. Legal counsel has filed a petition to reopen your case. She didn't rise immediately, just closed her eyes, and gently returned the torn photo to the metal desk drawer. Her lips moved. "Rook, I knew you would." And outside, the world began to shift. News spread like sparks through a dry forest. From local broadcasts to national morning shows, primetime talk panels to investigative specials. Kayla Monroe became the week's most urgent name, not because she was a former operative, but because the one who reignited justice was a dog. An old training clip from 2012 was restored from archived footage. In it, Rook, only 2 years old, was tasked with identifying a hidden microcamera sewn into a mock soldier's uniform. Not only did Rook detect the exact location, he alerted not by barking but with a look. That same look had reappeared at the memorial in Northlake. On the legal analysis program Justice Mirror, the two clips were played side by side, 2012 and now. Analysis grids lit up. Eye focus, tail stillness, nose angle, ear direction, a match rate of 92.3%. A behavioral psychologist specializing in working dogs spoke live. Rook didn't act from instinct. He acted from memory, from training, from a command that was never spoken but never forgotten. At Hemlock's front gates, crowds began gathering. No loudspeakers, no colorful banners, just hand-lettered signs on white boards. "We believe in Rook." A young woman stood at the front, holding the leash of a golden retriever. On the dog's collar was a metal tag, etched with the name Milo Therapy Dog. She said nothing, just gently stroked her dog's back the way someone, long ago, had done for Rook. One night the wind howled. Someone set up a projector outside the gate, replaying the old training video on loop, all through the dark. The light from the screen danced against Hemlock's stone walls. Not to protest, but to remind. Some truths don't need to be shouted, they only need to be seen. Inside cell 17, Kyla sat near the shuttered window. She couldn't see out, but deep down, she knew that light was real, like sunlight slipping through a locked keyhole. And that same night, in a federal conference room 200 miles away, the Office of Justice Oversight issued a high-priority memo. The Monroe case is now under full review, not because of public pressure, but because something never wavered the instinct to protect the truth. The memo was stamped and sent to all relevant departments, but at the bottom, in faint handwriting, "Source unknown," a line was added. Because some barks aren't cries for attention. They're how you say, "I remember." That night there were no sirens, no rushed footsteps. Everything moved as if nothing had changed, but everything had. A document was placed on the desk of Hemlock's warden, the same place Kayla Monroe had spent 7 years. Without a calendar, without seasons, without a sound from the world outside. The warden read the line, then slowly folded the paper. Warm yellow lamplight spilled across shelves stacked with files. But among them, one folder remained open. Monroe, Kayla, former Special Operations Unit. The warden didn't request a press conference, didn't plan a public exoneration. He simply turned to the guard standing outside his glass door. "Tell the driver to get the car. No markings, no lights. Use the north gate." "What about the media, sir?" "Don't tell the media. She doesn't need a headline. She deserves to walk out on her own." The guard nodded. No questions asked. The steel door at hallway D creaked open at exactly 4:17 a.m. In the darkness, the sound of the key turning in the lock echoed slowly, each click deliberate, as if even the prison itself was trying to listen. Could freedom really be returning? Kayla sat still. She didn't leap to her feet when the door swung open. She simply looked at the guard, then down at her hands. Hands that had once gripped a rifle, written field reports, rested gently on Rook's back every morning before deployment. Now, they trembled, just slightly. There was no one waiting at the end of the hallway. No escort. Every door along the path stood open as if the road had been drawn long ago, just waiting for the right soul to walk it. The north gate of Hemlock sat tucked behind a grove of aging pines. The wind whispered through the brittle branches, dry leaves rustling like secrets finally being spoken aloud. A silver-gray SUV waited with its back door open. Kyla approached but didn't step in right away. She turned, looked back at the stone wall, the one she'd stared at for 7 years, listening each night as the wind scraped against the bars, reminding her that somewhere beyond, light still existed. No one waved, no one called out. But in her heart, she knew someone was still waiting. And at that very moment, almost 300 miles away, in a weathered wooden cabin on the edge of North Lake, Rook opened his eyes. Not because of a sound, but because something had shifted in the air. A space had just been filled. Murphy sat by the fireplace, reading. He looked up and saw Rook quietly rise, step away from the rug. No panic, no confusion, just steady, grounded footsteps like the dog already knew exactly where he needed to go. Murphy didn't call out. He didn't ask. He simply stood, opened the door, and whispered like a father letting go of a grown child. "Go on, Rook. She's waiting." And Rook walked off the wooden porch, didn't look back. Through the wind of that early morning, there came a silent echo. A reunion was beginning. No one knew it yet, but it had already begun. There were no protesters at Hemlock that morning. No news vans, no reporters. The sun hadn't yet risen past the horizon, but the thin mist had already started to lift, dissolving quietly, as if even the air was making way for something sacred. From beyond the outer gate, someone was walking towards the prison. A figure in a worn, earth-colored coat, no hat, no sunglasses, only eyes, deep, still, and silent like the bottom of a winter lake. Kayla stopped at the iron gate. Over her shoulder hung a small bag with fraying straps. Her shoes were faded, weathered, the same pair she'd worn the day she was taken. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. Because right then the gate unlatched from the inside. As if the world, after too many years of silence, had finally whispered, "You've been forgotten long enough." She stepped forward. Every footfall pressed into the cold dirt like passing over old memories, nights without stars, walls without names, dreams that always ended in the breath of a creature who never stopped waiting. And then, Kayla froze. Just beyond the gate, in the clearing blanketed with dew and mist, sat a quiet shape, low to the ground, still, a gray silhouette in the morning fog. Rook. No whistle, no command, no leash. Just one look, a thread stretched between two souls, each returning from opposite ends of forgetting. Kayla didn't run. She walked, slowly. Rook didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply rose to his feet, and when the space between them narrowed to a few steady breaths, Rook lifted one paw and placed it gently in her hand. It wasn't firm. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough to stop the wind, enough to make time pause, enough to sting the eyes of the guard behind the gate, though no one said why. Kayla dropped to her knees. She didn't speak, just wrapped her arms around him. No squeeze, no shiver. Like she was holding herself, the version of her that never stopped believing. If one dog remembers me, then maybe the world hasn't turned all the way away. Rook pressed his head into her shoulder. No crying, no licking her face. Just sitting there. With her. Side by side. One who had been locked away, one who had been cast aside, now side by side in the frozen morning light. No one interrupted. No one dared. Because some reunions don't need justice. Only a touch. A freelance photographer, the only other person at Hemlock's Gate that morning, had stopped by, intending to snap a few shots for a write-up on federal prison conditions. He'd never heard of Kayla Monroe. Didn't know the name Rook. But he raised his camera and captured it. A moment unposed, unframed, unstaged. Just Kayla, forehead resting against Rook's, her fingers trembling not from cold, but because after 7 years, she had finally touched the one thing that had kept her alive, waiting without reason. No medals in the photo, no uniforms, no speeches, no fists raised, no flags flown. Just two figures, one kneeling, one standing tall, a warrior once silenced, a soul that never needed words. The photo went up on the photographer's personal blog. No hashtags, no headlines, only 6 quiet words beneath it. When faith refuses to die. 36 hours later, the image hit front pages across the country. 72 hours later, it was everywhere from single mothers in Arkansas to veterans in Utah to high schoolers in the Bronx. People sent it to each other without needing to explain. It had moved beyond politics. It was no longer just about Kayla Monroe, or even just a dog named Rook. It had become something deeper, a stubborn ache for something fading from society. Faith. Between humans. And what's good? The image never spoke, but in its silence were hundreds of thousands of comments, millions of shares, captions that simply read, "I cried? We need more Rooks. Thank you for not giving up." And from newsroom desks to law offices to K-9 units across the country, people began calling her something else. No longer traitor. No longer prisoner 711K. They didn't call her traitor anymore. They didn't even call her hero. They called her the one who came back. That day, Kayla sat in the small back room of the old wooden house, the one where she and Rook had been temporarily placed. Soft morning light spilled in through the window, landing gently on her hand as it rested on Rook's head. The rhythm steady. Neither of them said a word. They never really needed to. On the wall behind them, the photo from the Hemlock Gate had been printed, laminated, and taped up. But it wasn't the photo that made Kyla pause. It was the sound of a phone ringing. The cell phone on the table lit up. Unknown number. Kayla hesitated. She almost didn't answer. But then Rook looked up and gave the smallest nod. She picked up. On the other end was the voice of a young boy. Trembling. Software but clear. "Is this Miss Monroe?" "This is she." "My name is Eli, I'm 12. My dad was a police officer, but he got shot last year, while he was on duty." Kayla sat upright. The air shifted, her hand tensed slightly on Rook's head. "I'm sorry for calling. I needed to say something." She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Eli took a deep breath. "I used to hate dogs. After my dad died, I stopped trusting them. I thought, if dogs were really loyal, then maybe his K-9 should have saved him." Kyla clenched her fingers around Rook's fur, still silent. "But that photo, the one of you and Rook, it made me think again." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't know why, but suddenly I wanted to believe again, that some dogs still remember, still wait, and that maybe justice can come from something as small as a paw touching a hand." There was a pause. "Just breathe," and the faint sound of sniffles. Kayla pressed her hand to her mouth. Rook leaned into her leg. Then Eli said one last thing, his voice a little lighter now. "I'm sorry I stopped believing, and thank you for not." The line clicked. The call ended. Kayla had said nothing the entire time, but her eyes shimmered, and Rook gently licked the back of her hand. There was no speech that day, no formal announcement of reinstatement, no televised redemption arc. Just the voice of a child saying what an entire system had forgotten. Trust doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be held on to long enough for someone else to find it again. The day Kayla was invited back to the Rapid Response Unit in Dallas, she showed up. She sat in the exact same chair as before, inside that meeting room. Her fingers ran over a tiny scratch on the tabletop, the one where she had once rested her very first training journal. They handed her the reinstatement papers, bold black ink, official seals, signed by all the right names. They said all the right things. They looked at her with gratitude, the kind of gaze they should have given her a long time ago. She listened, then gently shook her head. "Thank you, but I already have a place to go back to." The air in the room dropped. No one objected. No one tried to persuade her, because in her eyes at that moment was something they all understood, but none could touch: freedom. 1 month later, a small center opened near Lake Whitney. It wasn't a training facility. There were no iron gates, no alarms, just a quiet stretch of land with open wooden kennels, low trees casting cool shade, and a simple sign on weathered gray wood that read, "Where warriors are called by their true names." Kayla didn't promote it. There were no interviews, no magazine features. But the ones who came, they understood. These were the dogs labeled unfit for duty, flagged as aggressive, resistant, or worse. Left behind. One by one they arrived. No commands, no forced obedience, just a place to lie down, and someone willing to see them the way Kayla once saw Rook, buried deep in a forgotten stack of files. Rook wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a companion, the very first teacher. Each morning, Rook would make his rounds. No barking, no judgment. He simply paused in front of each new dog, lowering his head just a bit, as if to say, "I was there too." And somehow, the dogs understood. Some late afternoons, when the sun kissed the edge of the hills and fallen leaves scattered across the dirt paths, Kayla sat quietly on the wooden steps, watching Rook play with a 3-legged puppy, not to teach it how to fight, but to remind it that it still mattered. She never returned to the unit. Because sometimes, what needs protecting isn't behind a front line. It's in the places no one thinks to look. Mirror Haven began receiving more of the so-called non-compliant, difficult, or expired service dogs. No attached paperwork, no clear reasons, just eyes full of confusion, curved spines, and labored breaths, as if every inhale was its own kind of resistance. Some refused to eat. Some lay still in the corners of their kennels for 3 days without moving. Some howled softly at night, long and low, carrying the ghosts of old battlefields in every echo. Kayla didn't train them. She was simply present. And Rook somehow did what no one expected. He brought them back from the shadows. No orders, no drills, just a steady gaze, soft steps around the kennels, and those gentle touches with his nose, as if telling each forgotten comrade a tiny story. I was abandoned too, but I made it back. One winter night, the fog was thick, and Rook refused to return to his kennel. Kayla called out, but he only looked at her, then turned his head toward the fence, where a deaf, elderly K9 had arrived that morning. Kayla waited a long time. until she saw Rook lie down beside him. No touching, no gestures, just being there. By sunrise, the old dog lifted his head for the first time. At Mirror Haven, no one counted how many dogs were rehabilitated. No one tracked how long each one took to step out of their old wounds. Only one thing remained consistent every day. In the morning, Rook would do his rounds and sit quietly in front of one kennel. His eyes are never harsh, only patient, because Rook understood. Sometimes all it takes is one creature refusing to give up on you, to make you choose to live again. That day, the sky was gray. No rain, no sun, just a cold light draped across the steps of Mirror Haven, as if the world was holding its breath, making room for something new that was just about to arrive. Kayla was in the back room, quietly sorting through the medical records of the newly arrived dogs, when a shadow appeared on the path outside. No one had called ahead. No appointment was listed. But Kayla knew, from the way the door didn't slam, from the footsteps trying not to rush, from the breath caught halfway in her throat. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. Kayla stepped outside. Said nothing. She recognized him, the man who once sat in the hearing room years ago, who didn't meet her eyes, who said nothing in her defense, but didn't turn away either when the accusations were read aloud under the cold white light of the overhead fixtures. He wasn't the one who condemned her. He was the one who chose silence. Between them lay a small courtyard, scattered with fallen leaves. Rook emerged from the kennel behind her, standing beside Kayla. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stood still, watching the man who now looked down with trembling shoulders and eyes rimmed red. He didn't bring a gift. No letter of apology, no elaborate explanation. Just one sentence, soft as a breeze slipping through winter air. I knew. It was wrong that day. Kayla didn't nod, didn't turn away. She simply stood, like a wall that had once been knocked down, now learning to stand again, not to keep anyone out, but to witness. Rook stepped forward, pressed his nose gently against the back of the man's hand, still bearing the old calluses of years gone by. Then turned away. No hesitation, no resentment. Because some wounds don't need punishment, they just need to be acknowledged. On his way back, the man stopped at a gas station. He sat in his car for nearly 15 minutes without starting the engine, staring at his own palms, and for the first time in years, he wept, not out of guilt, but because someone, without saying a word, had forgiven him. Back at Mirror Haven, Rook resumed his morning rounds. No one asked, no one brought it up, but from that day forward, every new dog that arrived was greeted the same way, with a soft brush of Rook's paw, a quiet signal that said, "You're not alone." That afternoon, the sun slanted low behind the pine trees at the edge of the sanctuary, casting long shadows of two quiet souls onto the dry, golden earth. Kyla sat against a boulder, gently twirling an old rope in her fingers, the very rope they once used to tie Rook's muzzle back during those first training days. Rook lay beside her, his head resting on her leg, breath steady, eyes half closed, as if listening to a story he already knew, but still wanted to hear again, just in her voice. Kayla began speaking, not loudly, not softly, just like a breeze skimming the still surface of a lake. Back then, our unit had 7 people. Now there are only 2 names left that haven't been marked as MIA, KIA, or never spoken of again. She paused, her eyes drifting toward a sky slowly fading to ash. They laughed when you picked up a strange radio signal at the border post. Said I was paranoid. Obsessed. Rook didn't move, but his tail gave the slightest twitch, just once, like he was answering something only the two of them could understand. Some died because a road wasn't cleared for mines. Some never came back from a raid deep inside the red zone. But the worst kind of death— She lowered her gaze to the scar on her wrist, left from the night they dragged her from base in silence— is when your truth has no one left to hear it. Kyla ran her hand down Rook's back, where his once dark coat now held strands of silver. It's not anger I feel. Not anymore. She exhaled slowly. I just wish they'd been patient enough to hear your first bark. That bark wasn't an alarm. It was a reminder. Something was wrong. Still, Rook made no sound. But this time he rose, gently pressing his head to Kayla's chest. A gesture not often made, but full of meaning. Kayla closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't speak again. She simply tightened her grip on the frayed rope, the last thing she had from a time when they were still trusted. The one thing that had never lied to her. And beside her, Rook, once discarded, once labeled unfit for combat, stayed right where he was, not to guard, not to watch, but to remind her that even if no one says their names anymore, the old battlefields still echo. Only, not many stay still long enough to listen. The season's first winds arrived, carrying the scent of damp soil and rustling dry leaves behind the old kennel path. Kayla sat alone on the wooden steps, a mug of ginger tea steaming in her hands. She did this every night. But tonight, the silence was heavier. Out in the yard, Rook didn't move. He sat facing the far gate, body still as stone. His back looked thinner. His shoulders sloped like a worn rucksack that had traveled too far. His left leg, the one that once vaulted over steel fences, once pounded through mortar-streaked terrain, now trembled slightly. Kayla didn't call him. Because she knew when Rook chose that spot near the gate, facing it directly, it meant he was waiting, not for someone, but for something only he could sense. She set her mug down, pulled on a thick coat, and walked out to join the faded gray shadow sitting still beneath the soft drizzle. Rook didn't turn, just flicked one ear back, as if to say, I know you're here. Kayla sat down beside him without a word. Her gaze followed Rook's, toward the front gate, where only a flickering light remained, swinging gently with the creak of old metal in the wind. Does it hurt? She asked, voice light as mist breaking on grass. Rook didn't answer, but his tail, still bearing an old scar, swept across the earth once, drawing a gentle arc in the wet dirt. The vet had said it a few weeks ago. Rook's heart was weakening. Slow. Uneven. The meds could buy time, but not forever. Kayla knew. Rook knew, too. And still, every night, instead of curling up inside, wrapped in blankets, Rook came to this very place, at the same hour, facing the same direction, as if, so long as he sat there, something remained unfinished, and that something was enough reason to keep going. No more battlefields, no more orders, just friendship, unshaken. The cold wind picked up. Kayla reached out, resting her hand lightly on Rook's head. His fur, once dark and sleek, had turned soft and pale with time, but his eyes, those same eyes that had once held steady through interrogations, that had barked once when the whole world stayed silent, never changed. Kayla smiled, not with sadness, not with grief, but with peace, because no matter how many years passed, Rook had never forgotten the habit of waiting, in the very place where he once saw the one he trusted most come home. The early wind threaded through the leaves, brushing gently across the soft grass on the hillside. A few white petals drifted down like sentences left unfinished from a conversation that had long passed into memory. Kayla still came here every final Sunday of the month, not to mourn, but to accompany. In that open space, once a training yard echoing with barks each time she walked past, there was now only the wind and the shadows of memories that had never faded. That morning, beside the small wooden plaque, there was a new bouquet. Nothing fancy, just a bunch of white dahlias, bound with a faded green twine. Kayla knelt, slipping a small card from the stems. The handwriting was neat, careful, no signature. I made the team. I wear the R17 badge now, just like I promised. I still remember those eyes. I still believe one dog can change someone's whole life, just by choosing not to leave. Kayla looked up. In the soft morning light, the ink on the card seemed to touch a memory only she could see, but it felt as vivid as yesterday. The boy who once called Mirror Haven with a shaky voice on a public phone was now a man in uniform, and he had kept his word. No need to come in person, no ceremony, just once a year. On that day, a bouquet, a card, and a quiet reminder. Rook hadn't disappeared. He'd become a part of what good still moves forward. Kayla sat down, her back against the wooden wall, the card still resting in her palm. Her eyes drifted toward the gate at the crest of the hill, the spot where Rook used to wait every evening. The place that once stood between loss and hope. And when the wind passed again, she could almost hear Rook's footsteps, steady, grounded, the sound that once helped her rise, no matter how far she had fallen. Down below, a group stood in formation. Gray uniforms, each one paired with a dog, some tall, some lean, different coats and eye colors, but all focused upward, watching her. Not because of rank, not because of fame, but because of a story they'd been told the day they arrived at Mirror Haven. Kayla walked down toward them, slow but sure. Her gaze passed over every set of canine eyes until she stopped before a young woman standing beside a deep brown-eyed shepherd. "What's your name?" Kayla asked softly. "Lauren, ma'am," the woman replied, her hand resting gently on the dog's head. "And this one?" "Norik. He was cut from the state K9 program. Wouldn't respond to whistle cues. But I believe Norik just needs someone who understands him." Kayla nodded. She crouched down, offering a hand without touching, just a familiar gesture. Norik leaned in, sniffed briefly, then sat. Not out of submission, but like a whisper. "I'm ready." No one clapped, no one cheered, because truth doesn't need applause. Kayla stood again, her eyes carrying both memory and trust. You all know Rook's story, but what matters isn't what Rook did. That's why he did it. The wind stirred once more. A soft green now covered the earth where dust used to settle. "Here, no one's here to train dogs to obey. You're here to learn how to listen." A few puzzled glances, but then nods began to ripple outward. Slow, genuine. Kayla passed through the line of trainees until she stopped at the last row. There stood a boy, maybe 15, smaller than the rest, holding the leash of a pitch-black dog with one ear missing. He looked at her, said nothing. She smiled. "You know, Rook was like that too. Didn't say much, but always showed up when it mattered." Kayla didn't talk about the trial, didn't mention the pardon, didn't recount the sleepless nights or the days when memory was the only reason to keep breathing. She only said one thing, and she said it very quietly. When the world turns its back on you, look toward the one place that never closed, where a dog I'm still waiting. And somewhere, in the silence of the hilltop, in the rustle of the trees, beneath the fading afternoon sun, there was a space, not empty, but sacred. Because Rook's memory had never left. It remained in every scratch on the old wood porch, in every echo of a bark from years past, in the way the newest dogs still paused at the fence, as if waiting for someone to return. Kyla placed the old notebook into a drawer. The final page was filled. No conclusion, no final period. Just one line, slightly smudged. Some warriors don't need medals. They just need one person to believe. They never gave up. Outside, the trainees were walking their dogs through the quiet yard. No shouted commands, no whistles, just eyes meeting eyes, deep enough to understand, still enough to trust. One scruffy little pup, dark-coated, short-tailed, wide brown eyes, paused at the steps. He sniffed around a sunken patch of grass, then looked up. No bark, no wag, just stillness. Kayla stepped out, sitting beside him quietly. She didn't reach out. She just sat, the same way she used to sit beside Rook. You hear it too, don't you? The pup didn't move, just slowly stepped closer, settling beside her, resting his head on her knee. Exactly like Rook once did. No applause, no soundtrack, no cameras, just a touch. As if Rook, from somewhere beyond, had crossed one more invisible border just to finish the last chapter, without needing a single word. And for those who once listened, who once waited patiently, who chose to believe instead of doubt, that moment was enough. Some stories don't need to end with victory or revenge. Sometimes all it takes is a long enough gaze, a bark at the right time, or a simple touch to change the way the world sees a creature once deemed useless. Rook couldn't speak. But Rook told the truth anyway. Not through a statement, not with a file, but with loyalty that asked for nothing in return. The kind you don't teach, the kind you can't buy. Kayla never asked for her rank back. Instead, she built a place where the discarded, the forgotten, the misunderstood could be loved again, not because they were flawless, but because they still knew how to love. German Shepherds aren't just an exceptional breed. They are silent warriors who may bleed, may be cast aside, but have never once betrayed. And if you're reading this now, please believe, somewhere out there, in an old shelter on a quiet porch, beneath a tree you used to pass every day, a dog might still be waiting for you to come home. Not out of duty, but out of love.